Good morning, everyone, here in Washington, D.C. Online, good afternoon for those of you across the Atlantic, and good morning for those of you across the Pacific. Welcome to the 2023 CSIS Indo-Pacific Forecast. For those of you who are not familiar with the Indo-Pacific Forecast, formerly known as the Asia Forecast, this is an annual event we do at CSIS with the CSIS Asia team to scope out what's to be expected in the year 2023. My name is Victor Cha. I'm Senior Vice President here at CSIS and Professor at Georgetown. I think it goes without saying that we are in a period of dynamism when it comes to the Indo-Pacific. The variables for change are many, not least of which are things like the war in Europe, the intensification of great power competition between the United States and China, paradigm shifts in how we think about geoeconomics and industrial policy, and then rogue countries shooting off literally hundreds of ballistic missiles. These are just a few of the forces that are compelling governments to think and review what their strategies and policies should be going forward. We are going to try to address many of these issues in the course of the morning with our CSIS Asia team, and it will involve all of you as well, because this is an interactive exercise in which you will be participating in answering the questions. But before we do that, we have a very special session to talk about the current state of play in Northeast Asia and in Southeast Asia with Dr. Kurt Campbell from the White House, Ambassador Cho from the Republic of Korea, and Ambassador Romualdez from the Philippines. So with that, I'm going to first thank you all for joining us this morning. I'm going to turn it over to Nick Szechenyi, who is our Senior Fellow and Deputy Director of the Asia Programs, to get us started. So Nick and our special guest, if you could join us on the stage. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, good morning. Thanks, everyone. Real honor for me to join these three distinguished leaders to kick off our discussion today on regional dynamics in the Indo-Pacific. We'll invite each of them to offer brief opening remarks, and then we'll engage in a bit of a dialogue, and we'll take a question or two from the audience at the end, and then let them get back to their day jobs. I'd like to start with Dr. Campbell. Last year, very significant year for strategy in the Indo-Pacific. The administration unveiled its Indo-Pacific strategy. A lot of momentum on bilateral alliances, plurilateral networking, engagement in regional institutions, and visits to the region by the president, and also an important meeting with Xi Jinping to kind of map the trajectory for U.S. China relations. And you're bringing that momentum into this new year with the U.S. Japan leaders meeting here in Washington tomorrow. So if you don't mind, Kurt, if you could just give us your sense of the lay of the land and what your expectations are for this coming year.
Great. Nick, thank you very much. And let me just commend CSIS for doing this program year after year. It helps us in the policy community, or people who think deeply about Asia. It helps us track how people are thinking about this. I also want to commend Victor and the entire team here at CSIS. They're wonderful partners, wonderful friends. I have to just say one last thing, just as we get started here. Today at the National Cathedral, the president and several of us will have a commemoration of the life of former Secretary of Defense Ash Carter, and a good friend to all of us, a tremendous supporter of American engagement, both in the Indo-Pacific and elsewhere, strong partner and ally for all of us. And so we will remember him today, and it's important that we take that time. So, Nick, let me just say just a couple of things if I can. First of all, it's terrific to be on the stage with wonderful partners, unbelievably effective representatives of each of their countries. I'll just say 2 countries we want to do more with and engage more deeply with in 2023. Just to give you a sense just about sort of the immediacy of what we're dealing with right now, Nick, I think as you know, yesterday, Secretary Blinken and Secretary Austin held what we call the 2+2, which is sort of the operating mechanism of the U.S.-Japan relationship. And it was one of the most consequential engagements between our 2 countries in decades. And I think that will be, in many respects, rolled out and acknowledged by the 2 leaders, as you indicate, tomorrow, when Prime Minister Kishida arrives here into Washington. I do just want to note something unusual. Usually when a Japanese leader comes, it's perhaps directly from Asia. Prime Minister Kishida has just completed a remarkable visit through Europe in which the dominant topic was how Japan can work more closely with European countries to ensure that we are taking the appropriate steps to support Ukraine. And that, I think, underscores in many respects, Nick, the remarkable journey that Japan has been on in the last year, standing toe-to-toe with European partners and colleagues, leading the way in Asia to support strong steps, determined steps to indicate that what Russia is undertaking in Ukraine, this illegitimate, unbelievably provocative and destabilizing set of activities, has consequences for the Indo-Pacific, and that it is Japan and other countries who've also stepped up with us responsibilities to act in concert, and it has linked in important ways the Indo-Pacific and the transatlantic challenges. And he has been probably the most effective spokesman of how increasingly it's not, several theaters, but one theater, and in fact one set of challenges to the operating system, to the free and open order. Tomorrow, we will hear about how Prime Minister Kishida has taken steps to indicate responsibly that Japan is going to increase its defense budget over time to 2%. There are going to be a number of steps that are basically, again, announced or underscored for new capabilities. But what's important about this is, first of all, when countries sometimes set off on these journeys, they go alone. Not Japan. They have done this in the deepest possible consultation with the United States over months of painstaking discussions, not only in the State Department and DoD, but a lot of interaction at the White House and at the level of the Prime Minister's office. I will also say that Japan has consulted very broadly and widely, not just with, political folks or strategists here, but across the region as a whole. And I think there is an understanding that the environment around Japan has really changed for the worst over the course of the last several years. What Victor said at the outset is a situation that we're confronting, a North Korea that continues provocative steps, appears, at least at this time, disinterested in diplomacy, not only with the United States, but South Korea and Japan, and is on a very provocative path. Russia, for decades, tried to establish a diplomacy with Russia that would perhaps change the nature of the relationship between Japan and Russia. And I think Kishida and Japan decided that what had taken place was so serious that Japan had to essentially take a very hard stance against Russia. And that has changed the security dynamic between Japan and Russia. And of course, we're facing a continuing military buildup and military operations in China that I think those steps are unnerving to neighbors. And again, some of the things that perhaps don't receive as much attention here, but for instance, when Prime Minister Kishida hosted the Quad in May in Tokyo, a very productive session. As we met, a joint bomber patrol of China and Russia were circling Japan. It's sort of an unmistakable signal of cooperation on issues that are concerning. And so this will be a big event. I think we want very much to make clear that the U.S.-Japan relationship is foundational and we want to continue. But Nick, it will not stop there. We've got a lot of things that we're planning for 2023, active travel in the region. Grateful again that Japan will be in the chair in the G7. We plan to look forward to supporting those meetings. We will reconvene the Quad in Australia. We have to follow through on the promise of IPEF. We're at that critical stage that countries want to know what's in it for us. I think there are a lot of other issues that we're working on with relation to technology and the like. And as you point out, 2022 closed out with what we think was an important meeting between President Biden and President Xi in an effort to build a foundation, a floor into the relationship. And perhaps this is the time in 2023 to build some guardrails to ensure that although we believe the dominant feature of U.S.-China relations will continue to be competition, we want that to be productive, peaceful competition, and we want very much to channel that in arenas that are good for both of our peoples.
Thank you, Kurt, very much. Appreciate that comprehensive overview, not only of the challenges in the region, but the opportunities that robust alliance relationships and networking across the region provide. Let me turn to Ambassador Cho. Yoon government recently unveiled its own Indo-Pacific strategy. I would like to invite you to talk about that and South Korea's perspective on regional dynamics.
Well, thank you, Nick, and thank you, Kurt, for your very comprehensive, broad outlook for what had happened last year and also what will happen this year in the Indo-Pacific region and beyond. Well, as you all know, the 2022 was dominated by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And what is important for Korea and other countries in the Pacific about this is that this is not just an event that happened in Europe. It has very serious implications for Korea and other countries in the Pacific. Well, this is a direct challenge to the fundamental principles enshrined in the UN Charter and direct challenge to the international rules-based international order. And rules-based international order actually has been applied to countries in the Indo-Pacific for decades. And we, of course, have a great interest in making sure that this unlawful invasion would not have negative implications on the peace and security in the Pacific, to make sure that the rogue nations in our region will not take wrong lessons from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And in that respect, while it is regrettable that people of Ukraine has been suffering from this ongoing conflict, I think the international community and the United States have been responding to this event very robustly and a very right way. And I'm very proud to say that Korea was firmly in that international community efforts. Now, about Korea, we had an event in Korea, and that is inauguration of new government and new president in my country. And this new president actually revived the focus of Korea's foreign policy beyond North Korea issues and into global issues, into regional issues. So we have been very proactive from June last year. We have become part of many of the initiatives taken by the international community and the countries of Indo-Pacific region. Say, for example, Korea became a charter member of IPEF, Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, for example. Korea became a member of the U.S.-initiated Pacific Island Nation, the initiative that's called the Partnership in the Blue Pacific. So Korea is now part of that. And also, Korean president, for the first time, attended NATO summit held in Madrid, Spain. And not only that, we had a trilateral summit revived, Japan, US, and ROK. And also we had, at the leadership level, had a gathering of what we call the AP4, that is Australia, New Zealand, Korea, and Japan. And this demonstrates that now Korea is back in Indo-Pacific, is back in the world. And we are going to be very proactive this year, following up all the commitments and the plans unveiled in Korea. Now, finally, in December last year, Korea, as Nick said, announced our own version of Indo-Pacific strategy. That fact in itself demonstrates that Korea will be very proactive, will be relevant, and we're going to build a robust relationship with partner countries in the Indo-Pacific region. And we have announced our strategy, and 2023 will witness Korea is going to follow up with actions in implementing this new strategy. And finally, the Yoon Suk-yeol government has an emphasis, places its emphasis on the improving our relation with Japan and also strengthening our trilateral partnership among US, Japan, and ROK. And this in itself has huge implications in the future events that are going to happen in the Indo-Pacific region. So I look forward to many exciting things happen in the Indo-Pacific region and happen revolving around Korea's new policies. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. Ambassador Romualdez, please share your thoughts from an important ally and key player in Southeast Asia.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you to Dr. Cha for inviting me here, especially with the distinguished panelists, my good friend Dr. Kurt Campbell and Ambassador Cho. Well, for the Philippines, we are looking really in the year 2023, as we are getting out of this pandemic, more economic activity between our country and not only the United States, but the Western world as well, and the ASEAN region. We feel that the ASEAN region is in the right place right now at the right time, in the sense that we can actually ramp up our economic trade, especially with the United States. And we're very pleased that we were one of the first to join the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework that was planned out by no less than Dr. Campbell and his team. And we are looking forward to putting more teeth into that and being able to have more, as I said, economic activity. President Marcos, who was unprecedented, voted in as one of the most popular presidents now in the Philippines, is very keen on having economic ties, stronger economic ties, because that spells economic security. We don't have any problem with our military alliance. I think that's ongoing. We're strengthening it. We can make it even more stronger than it ever was. But as I said, economic activity plus our alliance is very important. A formula that we were able to do in the past was the Subic shipyard, which was actually a shipyard that was started by Hanjin, South Korean, but was taken over by the banks. The way we were looking at that point is that while we would like to have more economic activity between the Philippines and China, being a neighbor, but we were also quite disturbed by the fact that they came in very strongly wanting to take over that project, and they were willing to give us any kind of loans and whatever. But learning from the curve from what happened in Sri Lanka, we could see that this is a red flag. And so it's very opportune that the United States came into the picture, and now we have a perfect relationship where we have the shipyard taken over by an American finance company that is now being run by this company. At the same time, it's being used for our Navy and the United States Navy. This is a good formula where we can have both our economic and alliance in a perfect position. So at the end of the day, the Philippines really is looking at having a very robust economic relationship with the United States and our ASEAN neighbors. In fact, last night we just had a long meeting with the American Chamber and some members of the business community here in Washington, D.C., and they were very eager to hear from us. We had the other ASEAN ambassadors present on how we can lure more investments coming into our countries. And they were very pleased that, especially in the Philippines, we're prepared to even change our laws to make it even easier for business to come in. And so we're looking, again, at the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework as the key to having more of this economic trade between our two countries. And I'll stop there and just answer the questions later. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will take advantage of my role to ask a few follow-up questions, and then we'll turn to you all as well. Let me start with Ambassador Romualdez. President Marcos also visited China recently. Reportedly, several agreements were signed, but Philippines is also on the front lines of various forms of assertive behavior in the South China Sea. So if you could just take a minute or two to share with us your perspective on the relationship with China and how to manage that going forward.
Policy as far as China is concerned is we're trying to reach out to them, but now in a more direct way in terms of the issues surrounding the South China Sea, the issues that we have with them. And President Marcos was very direct when he met with President Xi last week about the issues surrounding that. But we don't want it to be just one, just only an issue. We feel that there's a bigger picture to it, and that, again, going back to a more exchange of ideas on economic prosperity for both our countries is more important than anything else. And so we're looking at the formula, again, to be able to let China see that this is more important than anything else than just territorial disputes. We want to be able to settle that in a good way. We are very open by telling them that our relationship with the United States is something that is absolutely special and it's important for us, and we have no intention whatsoever of changing our tact when it comes to that. And I think President Marcos came out of that important one-on-one meeting with President Xi very hopeful, to say the least, that we're looking at 2023 to be a better year rather than having a more confrontational type of situation with China.
Great, thank you. Ambassador Cho, I greatly appreciated your summation of South Korea's approach to connecting to this network of partnerships in the Indo-Pacific, and look forward to seeing that Indo-Pacific strategy implemented. But I have to take advantage of this opportunity to draw you back to the Korean Peninsula and ask you about North Korea's strategy and where you see that in the coming year.
Well, let me see. I cannot see positive things coming out of North Korea in any case. Last year was a record year for North Korea's launch of ballistic missiles. I think 69 in all. That's a record. And we had a distant second, I think about 5 or 6 years ago, that was like 20-something. So Kim Jong-un was really focused upon somehow launching these ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, SLBMs, ICBM engine tests. And he went into some of the conventional provocations as well by sending in the UAVs into the territorial airspace of my country. Of course, our constitution says that North Korea is part of ROK in any case. But so this is very, very serious. And we all know that Kim Jong-un is not is a happy man these days, because North Korea's economy, always bad over the years, but really in shambles these days. Their external trade was dwindled into, I think, less than 5% of the peak years back in 2011, 2012. So what this says is that Kim Jong-un has difficulty delivering on his promises to his people, what they call the dual pursuit of nuclear weapons and the economic developments. Yes, he delivered to some extent on his promise to give a nuclear capability to North Korean people, but it was an utter failure for him in terms of delivering the economic development to North Korean people. So much so that in this year's New Year reporting in the party conference, the Kim Jong-un devoted only about, I don't know, maybe less than 20% of his reporting in economy, devoting much more to the nuclear weapons, much more to the need for a strengthening internal discipline, meaning that preventing outside cultures coming into North Korea and influencing the younger generations of North Koreans. So what I'm saying is that North Korea's provocations is a huge threat, and we are responding very strongly against it in close coordination with the United States. The alliance is responding to North Korea's nuclear and missile threats, and this will continue this year. But one of the big stories for North Korea is that North Korea has utterly failed in terms of providing for basic needs of the North Korean people. So this dynamic, how it's going to evolve in North Korea, I think is worse for international community to close watch what's happening in North Korea, because this dynamic is continuing. So this is a very important challenge for North Korea, for South Korea, for the Indo-Pacific countries, for the whole international community. And North Korea is not in a very happy place only because they fired like scores of missile launches, but North Korea's economy is in fundamentally difficult and rock and hard places, basically. So this is very important for us, important challenge. I'm very glad that you asked that question, because when I came here to Washington, D.C. about 7-8 months ago, actually some of the meetings I had with American officials or think tank experts, nobody talked about North Korea anymore. And I believe it's a good thing that you have to have an abiding interest in what's happening to North Korea challenges, because these are important common challenges U.S., ROK, and other countries are facing together. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. We'll certainly talk about that today and reinforce your comments about the importance of U.S.-Japan ROK cooperation in that context. Dr. Campbell, feel free to react to anything you've heard, but I'd also welcome your thoughts on the networking dimension to the Indo-Pacific strategy. You mentioned the Quad, Ambassador Cho mentioned U.S.-Japan ROK. We have U.S.-Japan-Australia partnership evolving, as well as AUKUS. So if you could just expand on that a little bit and how that features as we look at the challenges ahead.
Great, Nick, thank you. And I just for friends and colleagues, like these are challenging jobs and challenging times, but one of the wonderful things is you got to see just in a brief snapshot, the quality and character of the people that countries have sent to the United States to represent their countries. It is a pleasure to work with both of these fine ambassadors who are dedicated, honorable, honest, and always putting best foot forward in terms of working with the United States. Look, I do believe the search for closer networking ties, that the origin of the allied partner system with the United States was what is often called the sort of the hub and spoke, which you've written a lot about, Nick. I think the next phase is, again, more this networking. And what's interesting and important about strategy in Asia, if you look at the Philippines, if you look at South Korea and Japan, their ties with other states in the region, not just economically, but diplomatically and in security, have been enhanced dramatically. The other country that I think each of us would also recommend or recognize that each of our countries has an interest in drawing more into the Indo-Pacific is in fact India. And that's not just with respect to the Quad, South Korea, dramatic increase in economic engagement, the Philippines also working with India. Our interests are to see India playing an ever larger responsible role in almost everything that we're doing more generally. I think for the United States in the period ahead, the key is going to be following through on many initiatives that we've laid out. I appreciated very much Ambassador Cho talking about the Partners of the Blue Pacific, for instance. We've had many stop and start efforts in the Pacific over decades. This is clearly an increasingly important, vast region, has strategic import, deep moral and political responsibilities for the United States. Our forefathers served there during a very difficult period in the Second World War, and it is increasingly contested. It will be important for our countries to work together on initiatives that respond to the daily needs and challenges of the people, from climate change to food insecurity more generally. And so I think a huge part of what I've been focused on, Nick, is to ensure that, too often sometimes new things are put out there and then you turn to something else. Follow through is going to be essential, and I still am struck by one of the most essential, algorithms of Asia, which is just the importance of showing up. And it's a long way, but I will say I found the recent visits of the president to Southeast Asia very positive, and the response to those visits from friends in the region, the recognition that the United States is seeking as much as possible to engage directly in person, and also the vice president as well, that gives us heart to want to make those long visits and those long trips. But it is increasingly an essential part of the equation, that it's impossible. It's not, again, not just enough to show up, but without it, there's very little that's possible.
Great, thank you very much. Well, I think we have a couple of minutes for one or two questions from the audience. If you could please raise your hand, identify yourself, and please be as brief as possible. Sure.
Hi, thank you for doing this. My name is Haejun Seo. I'm from Radio Free Asia. My question is focused on North Korea. I'd like to follow up with what you have brought up. We're seeing increased threats from North Korea, and also South Korea and the U.S. alliances, making sure that we're deterring North Korea's threat by increasing the joint military exercises. But my question is, there is a security dilemma that we're seeing. So I'm wondering, what are some options we have in order to mitigate this kind of dilemma? And going forward, what are some alternative options that the U.S. have in terms of the North Korean policy that the administration currently has?
Sure, start.
First of all, I want to commend everything and support everything that Ambassador Cho has said. I think we have worked extraordinarily closely on our North Korea policy together. I think what we've also seen is a substantial step up in not just U.S. ROK preparations and deterrent efforts, but also with Japan as well. You will have noted that the three leaders met in Cambodia in November, and at that time they took a very strong stance on maintaining deterrence and our firm response to the provocations that the ambassador has laid out. I think all three countries also underscored, and we continue to do this both individually and publicly and together, we are ready to sit down and talk with North Korea and talk about the future. I heard what Ambassador Cho said about not as much discussion about North Korea. I do think there is discussion here about North Korea, but I think there is probably some frustration because many of the strategies that we have tried with respect to reaching out, providing opportunities for venues for engagement have generally been ignored. And instead, a increasing set of provocations and fiery rhetoric. And I still think that it's important and impressive that each of our three countries stand ready for dialogue. But I think the conditions that Ambassador Cho describes are clear. I think it is also the case that we have reached out to China to ask for their help here. I don't have much beyond what has already been said here. I think the hope will be at some point they will get off this path, but I can't tell you that we see any signs of this at this juncture. Ambassador Cho?
If I may add, North Korea has an option. Unlike some countries in other parts of the world, North Korea has an option to choose economic development as an important part of their future. And that's good for North Korea, good for the North Korean people, good for North Korean people's human rights as well. Instead, North Korean leadership, unfortunately, is choosing the wrong path. So as Dr. Campbell said, the US and ROK are making very, very clear, crystal clear, that we are ready to have a dialogue with North Korea. No preconditions. We can sit down with North Korea. We can talk about a better future, better common future for all the countries involved. It is very unfortunate. And my president's new proposal for North Korea, it's called the Audacious Initiative. It's all about that. We are presenting North Korea with an alternative, better future for North Korea, North Korean people, and all countries in the region. And I hope that North Korea will think about this more thoroughly and respond positively to our proposal. And I also like to add that human rights of North Korean people are very important. So that's why Yoon Suk-yeol government appointed our own North Korea human rights envoy last year. And that position was ordained by the North Korea Human Rights Act of the Korean government, was intentionally vacant for the last 5 years. We filled up that position. I hope that while we are pursuing a solution for a North Korean nuclear problems and whole North Korean nuclear issue, but human rights will have to be an essential part of that efforts in the future.
Great, thank you. Right here.
My name is Siddhant Kishore. I'm a graduate student at the American University. My question is to Mr. Campbell. If U.S. considers investing in force posturing in the Indo-Pacific, would that be a good way to confront Chinese or perhaps North Korean threats? If yes, then how would our allies and our regional partners would perhaps accommodate those requests of force posturing by bases or military construction? I would request the ambassadors to maybe reflect on that as well. Thank you.
So I think the security engagement between the United States and other partners in India is multifaceted. I think we are seeking to enhance staff-to-staff dialogues, more strategic engagements, or we review developments not only in the Indian Ocean but the Indo-Pacific. I think we have stated clearly our interests to help India diversify away from its reliance largely on Russian military supplies. We've worked closely with a number of other nations, like-minded nations, that also seek that goal. I think ultimately we want to see an India that increasingly operates in the Indo-Pacific in a responsible way And you see that reflected in a number of engagements with Indian partners in Hawaii as part of SINCPAC, or Pacific Command, I think it's called now, and also closer coordination militarily with Australian navies, other navies of Southeast Asia. I think we see this as a productive step. I myself have been fortunate to be engaged in deep discussion with Indian partners about the Indo-Pacific region, about Southeast Asia, about Northeast Asia, and the like, and the Pacific. I've had them for, in and out of government for almost 25 years. Our most recent one in the fall, to be perfectly honest, it was difficult to tell. We could have exchanged our talking points. There is so much identity of purpose. And I do want to just say, again, I think my colleagues, Nick, Victor, have pointed out all the challenges. But I will also say, in many respects, many of the allies and partners and countries that we seek to work with have sought to associate and rise to those challenges. The trajectory of U.S.-India relations, not just in the security field, but increasingly in education and technology and people to people, even economics, India's joined IPEF as well, suggests in many respects, a shared trajectory and a much closer partnership that I think gives us a sense that what we can hope for and expect in the U.S.-Indian relationship is better and bigger things in the future. And I think that includes working more together as partners on the security side as well.
We're very close to the end of our time, but Ambassador Romualdez and Ambassador Cho, if you want to address security cooperation.
Well, in the Philippines, as I said, we have our economic and security engagements with the United States has been, I would say, excellent in the past, especially in the past months since our new president took office. And I'd just like to add to what Dr. Kurt said about President Biden going to many of these meetings in the Asian region, which is very much appreciated. But I can say also one thing very important, and I think Dr. Kurt knows this, is you have a very big asset in President Biden. His personality is so well liked by many of our leaders in the ASEAN region. And the brilliant move that you had last year on the ASEAN summit with the leaders, the ASEAN leaders invited here to Washington, D.C. was a home run. That kind of relationship is very important, an in-person relationship. And I think that if we continue along that path, we will have more, I would say, a more direct way of being able to cooperate in finding ways and means to be able to move forward for a better world.
I have to say, the ambassador's being gracious here because we did have a wonderful dinner that night with the ASEAN leaders, and Ambassador Romualdez was there, and the president knew his nickname. His nickname is Babe. Everyone calls him Babe, and came up and gave him a big hug, called him Babe and stuff, and he was a little surprised by that, but I think it all went okay. All right.
I'd like to echo some of the points. I fully agree with what my good friend Ambassador Romualdez said about President Biden. I think President Biden, even from the days when he was senator, the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and also vice president, was a great asset to American diplomacy. I just hope that in spite of the political season that's coming up in Washington, D.C. and across the United States, I hope that President Biden will be able to avail himself into this diplomacy and working with other nations and other nations' leaders, because he is very effective, such a great diplomat.
Well, thank you all three very much. Certainly a lot of challenges, a lot of dynamism in the region, and I appreciate your instincts to conclude with an emphasis on the opportunities which we look forward to in the coming year. Please join me in thanking our distinguished guests. We'll take take a quick break and then start our China panel. Thank you. All right, hanging in there. I've been COVID negative forever, but since the second week of December, I've been fighting this cough.
I think it's good anyway that.
All right, thank you, everyone. I think we'll reconvene. Once again, I'm Nick Szechenyi, Senior Fellow, the Japan Chair, and Deputy Director for Asia here at CSIS. And it's my pleasure to introduce some of our colleagues to address issues related to China. And this, as Dr. Cha mentioned, this is an interactive event. And so we are going to flash some multiple choice questions on the screen. And we'd like your input on those questions, and we're going to use the results to shape our dialogue. We're going to use the Poll Everywhere platform today. So you can vote in two ways. You can go to pollev, pollev.com/CSIS Asia, where you will see the questions as they're shown on the screen. And make your selections, or you can text CSIS Asia in all caps to 22333, where you can enter, we also already have some active participants, where you can just enter the letter that corresponds with the answer you'd like to choose. So as you can already see, we're going to pose some questions, have a dialogue, and move right along, and we'll take some questions from the audience at the end. But you can continue to keep voting, which is great. We want you to vote as much as possible. Let me introduce my colleagues first. To my right, Jude Blanchett, who's a Freeman Chair in China Studies. Next to him is Scott Kennedy, Senior Advisor and Trustee Chair in Chinese Business and Economics. Next to him, we have Bonnie Lin, who's the Director of our China Power Project and a Senior Fellow for Asian Security. And it's also a pleasure to introduce Lily McElwee, a Fellow with our Freeman Chair. So let's begin. You already see question number one. Xi Jinping's greatest political challenge this year will be, fire away. Interesting. We'll wait a few more seconds. I'm told there's a bit of a lag for our online participants. COVID's making a comeback. Okay, great. I think we have some trend lines that are probably not going to change. So let's just hold there. So our audience says that the economy is going to be the greatest political challenge for Xi this year. Scott Kennedy, do you agree with that? And why don't you give us your assessment of China's economic challenges?
Well, good morning, Nick, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here to look into our collective crystal balls to see where China and the region, U.S. China relations are going. And I'd say broadly, I would agree with the audience. I think they've got it right, but my sense is really the overarching challenge for Xi Jinping is his governance credibility. It's taken a huge hit just at the time when he was, entering his third term, right? If he was running an election campaign last year and people were voting, the outcome would not have been the same. Luckily, he's in a political system that doesn't require popular support to get a new term. In terms of timing this year, I think it's really a tale of two halves in terms of what's most important. China is not out of the woods on COVID, and that is going to be issue number one. You can't get anything else done unless they get to the other side of the pandemic safely, and so far they're screwing that up pretty royally. It is a huge "I told you so" moment because everyone told the Chinese you need to vaccinate everyone with effective vaccines, which they didn't want to use. Everyone told them you have to prepare your hospitals, ICUs, therapeutics. They haven't done that. And everyone said that you have to provide comprehensive information, data, et cetera, and they've not done that. So this is going to be the bumpiest exit, and you're seeing lots of pushback and grousing by the Chinese public across the country. That's what generated the protests in late November and December. And the way they exit is as important as how they do. If they do, at some point, there will be an exit. They will get to the other side. And then the question for the rest of the biggest question, I think, politically for Xi Jinping the rest of the year will be on the economy. Can they signal that they can shift back towards emphasizing growth and adopt policies that genuinely support growth and have a stable commercial relationship with the rest of the world? There is just great skepticism domestically amongst Chinese business people, consumers, and the international business community. Even though we've started to see stocks rise on Wall Street and elsewhere, that's just one side of the story. The real economy, getting that going again will require a much greater dexterity by Xi Jinping and those he puts in place to run the economy over the rest of the year. To me, that's the biggest question mark for his quality of governance this year.
Jude, do you want to add to that?
No, not really. Except this is my juvenile mind, but the economy looks like a giant middle finger to Xi Jinping, and I can't help but think that's how he's feeling about it. We've done these, or I've done this forecast 3 years now, and my first top line thought is how important contingency and black swans are for shaping events that occur over the next 12 months. So as we peer into our crystal ball, the work of trying to prognosticate on China has always been a fraught exercise, but feels especially so now. But I just broadly echo Scott's comments that, first of all, I think what's good about the results here is we are showing that a realistic assessment of what occupies Xi Jinping's time. And we can often get into a narcissistic sense here in the United States that he wakes up thinking great power competition. But as a governor of a country of 1.4 billion, and especially dealing with all of the headwinds China is now, many of these self-imposed and self-created by Xi's own governance model, as Scott said, this is what I think is taking up 90% of his agenda. It's also important that COVID and the economy are intertwined as factors here, and the way that China has dealt with COVID over the past 2 years has played a very significant role in artificially depressing the economy, in addition to other factors like the real estate market and real estate policy, as well as sentiment in the private sector, which Xi Jinping has summarily dampened over 5 or so years of very aggressive statist policies. I think, I feel like I'm just echoing everything Scott said, but less eloquently. The big puzzle for me and question is, I feel as unclear as ever about the decision-making process in Beijing. If we just rewound a month or so, I would not have predicted a series of nationwide protests over COVID that had approximate cause in a fire in Xinjiang, although of course the ultimate cause was frustration with this years-long campaign of zero COVID. I wouldn't have predicted the protests. I wouldn't have predicted that one of the ways the party was going to deal with that was in part a immediate relaxation of what we thought was the signature policy of Xi Jinping that he was going to defend, till death, which was zero COVID. And I also wouldn't have predicted, as Scott just outlined, that the party, which, although those of us who work on China understand that the meme that it's able to plan 5,000 years into the future has never been true, we consistently give it probably more credit than it deserves about its planning abilities, and it has just been utterly confounding how little forethought the party put into taking this off-ramp for COVID. It is the worst, most ham-fisted way you could possibly do it, that now the party can no longer say, as Scott said, look at how well we've managed COVID compared to these ineffectual democracies. So, in short, everything Scott said I agree with, but I feel as unclear as we forecast throughout this event here on China and where it will be in December 31st of this year on all these factors. My honest answer is I have no idea.
Thanks for that. Maybe a common theme for China followers. U.S. China relations and Taiwan got some responses on that question. Not yet, Minji, thank you. We'll get to that in a minute, but before we do, Bonnie and Lily, anything you'd like to share on political dynamics in China?
Thank you. So I'll just add a little bit on that. So when I was choosing among these 4 options, I was wondering whether it was COVID or the economy, and I chose COVID, mainly because for some of the factors that both Jude and Scott mentioned, they're quite entwined. And the other thing I was thinking about is when you look at the economy, from what we just heard this morning, right, a lot of countries are seeking to work with China economically. They are, for example, like the Philippines is seeking economic deals. There are a lot of countries wanting to work with China. On COVID, what we've been seeing, at least in the last week or two, is that because of the likely uncontrolled spread of COVID in China right now, we're seeing China take measures against South Korea, against Japan in terms of visas. So it could be a source of not only internal tension, but also tension between China and some of our closest allies and partners. To date, we haven't seen China respond yet to U.S. requirements that Chinese visitors be tested, but that could be forthcoming. So I'm a bit worried about not only impacts of COVID domestically, but also internationally for China.
Is this on? I would just concur with what everyone else has said so far, and I do think the key challenge this year will be the economy, but I think it's also worth saying that, as Scott said, it might be a tale of 2 halves, and COVID and U.S. China relations are very much related to and will shape how China's economic growth fares this year. COVID will provide a very near-term challenge to quickly bringing production and consumption back up to pre-pandemic levels, especially the chaotic exit of the zero COVID policy. But U.S.-China relations, China relies on outside technology, components, know-how, capital for its economic growth, and it's to boost its productivity, and a challenging external environment characterized primarily by intensified U.S.-China tensions, and a very busy calendar ahead in terms of U.S. policy toward China on a technological level, I think is going to provide a damper, particularly in the second half of the year, on China's economic growth, and also going forward into 2024 and 2025.
Excellent. Just a reminder, please vote, pollev.com/CSIS Asia, or you can text CSIS Asia to 22333. So let's move on to our second question, what's the probability of China using military force against Taiwan in 2023? I'm going to vote this time. Stop talking. And I hope my kids are watching to see how savvy I am with this technology. Interesting. All right, well, I think we have a trend line established there, so maybe we can freeze. Thank you. So 80% of respondents said under 20% chance. Interestingly, this is a question we also asked last year, and at that time, a majority, 63%, said under 20% chance, followed by 23% who said 40% chance. So people are very confident that conflict is unlikely in the coming year. Bonnie, take it away. What do you think?
Sure. I am a bit surprised by this result because we did this poll, as Nick said, last year, and there were less people who were confident about China not using force, under 20% than this year. Maybe if we have time, I'd love just to hear from how folks voted, why there's such a difference. But from my perspective, the key to answering this question is how people actually understood the question. So is using military force against Taiwan, are folks interpreting that to be large-scale use of force, such as a blockade or invasion, or is that everyday use of force? For example, the routine flights that China conducts into Taiwan's ADIS. Because if you view that question as more the routine force, you would probably be in over 80%. But if you view this question as a large-scale force, which I think that's how people interpret it, that would be where you're under the 20%. I guess when we're thinking about whether China might use force against Taiwan, I think it's important to look at sort of the internal dynamics within China. And despite what we talked about in the first question, whether it's COVID, whether China has economic challenges, to date, we have seen no evidence that these internal problems within China is causing the CCP to want to use force against Taiwan or any of its neighbors. So we're not seeing any desire so far to externalize the domestic challenges. I would also note that earlier this year, China also appointed a new head of the China's Taiwan office, Song Tao, and in his New Year's message, he noted, there were a number of things that he noted, but what I found quite interesting was he commented on Taiwan's local elections, which occurred the past November, and he said that from that elections, the interpretation was that seeking peace, stability, and development are the mainstream public opinion in Taiwan society. I read that to be a message that potentially from Beijing's view, when they view the results of Taiwan's local elections, which is usually a good indication of the potential presidential elections in 2024, that it doesn't contradict China's view that Beijing could have a longer time horizon to deal with the Taiwan issue, which could align with what we're seeing in terms of 80% of the folks don't believe that China is going to use force against Taiwan this year. But I would also point out that there are also external factors that we need to take into account. And that's why I actually expected this poll to be more folks seeing that China might use more force against Taiwan in 2023 than last year. Because last year what we saw after Speaker Pelosi visited Taiwan was a China that was very willing to use military force to escalate, to demonstrate its displeasure against the United States, as well as broadly against our allies and partners. And we saw an unprecedented military exercise. And since August of last year, Chinese military activity against Taiwan has been escalating. Just looking at the number of Chinese flights into Taiwan's ADIS from August to December of past year, 2022, it's almost twice the number compared to the same time frame, August to December 2021, right? So if that is the trend, and we know that China is willing to use military force to demonstrate displeasure against Taiwan, we actually should be anticipating that if there is another incident that China views as provocative, it might be willing to demonstrate that force. So I would have expected this to be a little bit higher than what we see. Thank you.
Others want to chime in?
Well, I was going to say, I'm still trying to figure out in my head, what does it mean to have a 4% chance of an 80% probability? And maybe other people see that mathematically easier than I do, but I've been sitting here for 5 minutes trying to do that on paper. Yeah, I think Bonnie's right. I think the way we frame the question, which I completely get, is also indicative of just how fraught and confused our overall discussion on cross-strait relations is. I suspect, as Bonnie said, if we did a poll here of how everyone interprets the question, it's sort of like, definitions of God. You're going to get, ask 10 people, you're going to get 14 different answers as to precisely what they mean. If we're thinking, what's the probability of Xi Jinping, waking up, saying YOLO, doing a shot of whiskey and sending the PLA across the strait, I think we can put that probability close to zero, absent some extraordinary, exogenous action taken by the United States or Taiwan to fundamentally upset the balance, which I think we'd put that probability close to zero. If we were framing the question of how will China use its military to try to, coerce, deter the United States and Taiwan, I think we'd put this over 80. Because as Bonnie said, if we're thinking about military force, last August, the PLA shot short-range ballistic missiles directly over Taiwan's main island. That to me would be the use of military force against Taiwan, but it was not an invasion. So hopefully 2023 is the year where we move beyond the kind of silly, absurd invasion paradigm and move to the much more complex, difficult, but more pressing challenge of how do we collectively think about a more holistic, dynamic strategy of deterrence to keep China from using the entire spectrum of violence, threatened violence, coercion, intimidation on Taiwan. And right now many are solving for the easiest to conceptualize, yet least likely equation, which is that sort of outright invasion. And we're not spending our time, I think, on the much more vexing issue, which presents, which is right in front of us today.
Go ahead, Scott.
In the fall, when I went to China for 7 weeks, I went through Taipei. And on my flight from San Francisco to Taipei, I got the pleasure of riding along with the Little League baseball team from Chinese Taipei, who had just participated in the Little League World Series. Pilot announced they were on the plane, got third place, everyone cheered, said it in Chinese, everyone cheered again. Super cute 12 and 13-year-old kids. When I got to China a little bit later, I asked lots of people, is this your team? And there's only one correct answer to that question. Yes. But not everybody said yes. They said, well, if they're playing against the U.S., maybe we would root for them. And so then I asked them, if you ask the kids, who do they think they play for? What do you think they would say? And the grudging response was, Taiwan. This is an identity conflict between the two sides, which is not solvable straightforwardly. And I'd really encourage everybody to read a paper, an article in Foreign Affairs that Jude and Ryan Haas wrote that just came out a few weeks ago that really explains how difficult it is to solve this problem because there's an identity conflict between the two sides that isn't easily fixable. And so to me, the big question about this year and going forward is, will folks basically come to the conclusion that the only way to fix this is a war and conflict, and we're just going to prepare for that, and it's sooner or later? Or, as Jude and Ryan proposed, can we continue to just use our imaginations to figure out how to kick the can down the road and get to some point down in the future, which we can't imagine now, when the two sides will come up with some alternative type of solution? That's very hard to imagine right now, but I think the danger is we just get sucked into this idea that it's going to happen and we just prepare for that. And if that's what you're preparing for, then maybe it's not 2023, it's some other time. So I think the question is, how creative can we think about alternative futures and understand that this is something that's not going to be solved soon?
Willie, anything you want to add?
Not really, just very quickly. We heard from Dr. Campbell earlier saying that Asia-Pacific countries, Indo-Pacific countries are looking more toward Europe and the conflict in Ukraine, and I just wanted to say I think the reverse is true as well. There's greater interest from the European Union and individual member states in peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait and playing a role in that. So I think you're going to see more of that this year and in the coming years. And to what degree that changes China's calculus or timeline is uncertain. I'll defer to Bonnie and colleagues on that, but I just think that that's an important dynamic to keep in mind here, is that this is going to be, we're going to see more international attention on this flashpoint going forward.
Excellent, and that's a great segue to question number 3. Blank will engage China most effectively in 2023. Hopefully we won't have a debate about what engage means, but
Or effective.
you make that call. All right, this is a horse race. I'm going to wait a couple of seconds here. All right, well, maybe we'll, okay. Interesting. As you ponder the question, your perspective might change. All right, let's freeze it there. Lily, you spend a lot of time researching Europe's approach to China. Why don't you start? Europe was not the winner here, so to speak. Plurality chose Japan. But Europe obviously is increasingly focused on Indo-Pacific strategy and managing relationship with China. So why don't you share your perspective on that?
Sure. I would put my vote in with the European Union here. So I don't know how that changes the balance. But I think we do have to debate a little bit what engage means, because we're asking who's engaging China most effectively here. And to evaluate that, you have to think about what the goals are. And obviously there are quite stark differences between the goals of these 4 entities here, because the European Union mainly split between Russia and the United States, European Union, and Japan on the other hand. But I think the European Union would like this year to deter heightened Chinese belligerence toward Taiwan. It would like Xi Jinping, to the extent that he has leverage over Putin, to play a role in de-escalation in Ukraine. And more broadly, would still like China to move in the direction of becoming a more responsible stakeholder in the international system, whether that's playing to a greater degree by market rules, whether that's improving its human rights practices, whether that's engaging in efforts to address shared challenges like climate change and public health. And I think toward these goals, the European Union is somewhat well placed. One, because it's not the United States. There is a significant degree of mutual hostility, mutual mistrust between China and the United States right now that I think will prevent effective engagement to the extent that some U.S. efforts are looked at with greater skepticism by Beijing than the European Union's might be. And I'd also say that you see this at the public level too. There was a survey done of the Chinese public very recently, came out. I'm forgetting the journal, but it was January 5th by some researchers from the National University of Singapore that looked at Chinese public opinion toward the United States and European Union. Much, much more favorable toward Europe, despite European sentiment toward China falling quite sharply over the past few years. So I think there's a sense among Chinese analysts that Europe is still to some degree in play for China. And there's certainly a sense that, particularly when it comes to Berlin, there's a special partnership based on a very, very strong economic relationship that might make policymakers in Beijing a little bit more interested in what European partners have to say on these different issues. Finally, I would also just say that it's a numbers game, and the European Union and individual European member states will be seeing a lot of Chinese leaders this year. There'll be quite a bit of diplomatic contact, whether that's a visit by French President Macron early in the year. The Dutch Prime Minister and the Italian Prime Minister have also been invited to Beijing by Xi Jinping at the G20, and the Italian Prime Minister said she'll go. And you'll have the European Union-China summit probably in the spring. These are all occasions for, whether it's at the EU level or European member states, to share that Europe has a stake in peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. It would like Xi Jinping to please play a role in distancing China from Russia diplomatically, as well as preventing an escalation of the conflict. And all of these more amorphous goals on an economic and I guess sustainable development front that are also strongly held by the European Union. So I think there are certainly risks here. The European Union does not, I would say, does not have a unified view toward China these days. You have the three-part framework of economic competitor, partner, systemic rival that was put out in the 2019 European Union strategy on China. To me, this is more like a Venn diagram when it comes to European debate on China. Yes, you have people in the middle, and you have an increasing number of people in the middle who think that systemic rivalry should condition competition and partnership with China. As an example, the EU-China Agreement on Investment. There were, I recently looked into German debate on this issue, and within Berlin, you have such diversity in terms of attitudes toward China. There were key players from the liberals and the Greens who said, we can't have this investment agreement if we don't get commitments from China to improve its forced labor and human rights practices. This, to me, is an example of systemic rivalry conditioning those other two parts of the relationship. So I think while you have, my point there was you have more people moving, more countries and more leaders moving toward this middle, but you still have EU countries on the outsides where, partnership should be the main focus of our relationship there, or partnership and economic competition, but not systemic rivalry. And so I think that a risk in terms of effective engagement is really knowing what an EU position is on China, and I don't think that we're quite there yet.
Interesting. Thanks, Lily. Well, if we ask this question a year from now, I'll be very curious to see how the European Union fares. Bonnie, the U.S. came in last, if this were a race. 15% said U.S., probably reflective of complications in U.S.-China relations. What's your take on that and any other aspect of the response?
Sure. Thank you. So the way I interpreted this question is that if an actor has to be effective engaging China, China must be at least somewhat willing to listen to the concerns of that actor and address those concerns. So on the point of the United States, I don't think China is really willing to address any of the major issues in the bilateral relationship. And that's where I agree with Lily in the sense that looking at all across all these actors, right, from China's perspective, when it looks at the major powers, it views as several centers of power: the United States, the European Union, Russia, and China. Now that it's viewing, it's working with Russia, but I think at this point we're seeing some concerns in China about where Russia is going with Ukraine. So if Russia were to go to China with significantly more asks on Ukraine or other issues, I would be surprised if China would be as willing to address those concerns. But from the Chinese perspective, I do believe that they believe that engaging more with Europe can shape Europeans' views of China, particularly as European capitals, as Lily has laid out, they are formulating their own respective China policies, in addition to the EU coming together to think more critically about what their overall China policy is. So from that respect, I think China is probably most willing to address concerns from the European side. You know Japan better than I do, and I don't think China is as willing to address concerns from the Japanese end.
Thank you. Jude, Russia, 25%. I view that more as an act of desperation than anything else, but what's your reaction to that or any other aspects of the spread here?
Yeah, I would have put that probably a bit lower. It's not a really good position for China to be effectively engaging, or for Russia to be effectively engaging China. I was going to flip the question around and say China will engage X most effectively in 2023. And I guess maybe slightly different take than Bonnie on the U.S. component of this, because I think, if we look about, we like to think that we're in this new sort of lockstep, universal Cold War view about China, but I think most countries would be willing to repair relations with China if China just stopped doing stupid, aggressive things. And so China can engage the United States, the European Union, and Japan more effectively than it has if Xi Jinping stays on the trajectory he's laid out over the past few weeks. I don't think he'll be able to do that. I don't think he can help himself. But we can imagine a more pragmatic team in the foreign policy arena coming in Beijing with relatively, I should say, with Ambassador Qin now moving into Foreign Minister, Wang Yi taking Yang Jiechi's role, Zhao Lijian being reassigned. We're seeing the green shoots rhetorically of economic opening, reopening, reform, and then I think if Xi Jinping can hold a relatively pragmatic line, I think we'd find that actually in most of the countries, Russia aside listed here, or regions listed here, there'd actually be more willingness to find some sort of détente with China, given how it is still the world's second largest economy. So I think, and Scott and I were talking about this the other day, I think there might be an over-interpretation that we're all reading from the same hymn book on desiring a Cold War with China. I actually think there's room for that narrative to shift if China can play its hand well, that being the big asterisk caveat out there, which is Xi Jinping has shown himself uniquely capable of ruining a good hand that China has to play. So I wouldn't hold much confidence in this, but I would say, going back to the murky, shattered crystal ball view, that Xi Jinping has surprises us in many ways. He's surprised us, me at least, in how he's reacted to COVID. So I would hold this, we can no longer say that Xi Jinping is incapable of course corrections. They're not the course corrections we necessarily predicted, but I would say Xi Jinping has course corrected, or has at least changed tack over the last 6 months in ways that are surprising. So if I were advising them, I would say sit down, shut up, let the economy do the work, let the market do the work, don't make stupid mistakes.
I'm happy to chime in on Japan, but before I do, Scott, is there anything you want to add? Okay. Great. Well, I'm impressed by a plurality choosing Japan. Japan has a very nuanced China strategy. It's a delicate balancing act between deterring coercion and preserving a stable relationship with Beijing, which reflects a great degree of economic interdependence with China. So last December, Japan released a new national security strategy, which very clearly identifies China as Japan's greatest strategic challenge, but also notes that a constructive and stable relationship with China is very important. This week, with the U.S. Japan summit, you're going to hear a lot about Japan's efforts to strengthen deterrence, which you referenced earlier. That's one side of the equation. But I think you're going to see Japan also try to identify avenues for diplomacy with Beijing. That's challenging, especially because the intensity of coercive activity in the East China Sea is unrelenting. And so Japan has to find a way to deter and interact. It's a challenge for all these countries. But as a country on the front lines of the challenge, I think the international community will look to Japan for ideas on how to get at this relationship with China. So certainly a lot to look forward to in the year ahead. We got a few minutes left, and I also want to invite the audience to ask a question. Let's turn to question number 4 very quickly. Which of the following will be the most significant trend in U.S.-China economic relations this year? Export controls, tech decoupling, financial decoupling, breakdown of talks, stabilization of economic ties, and joint action with allies on Chinese economic coercion. Give it a few more seconds. All right, I think the leader's been established, so we'll stop there. Thank you. This is also a question we asked at last year's forecast, where a plurality, 37%, said further export controls, followed by joint action by U.S. allies, and kind of an even split between financial decoupling and breakdown, and least amount of confidence in stabilizing economic ties. Even more dramatic this year, export controls, export controls, export controls. But Scott, why don't you interpret that for us and sort of paint the picture for U.S.-China economic relations going forward?
Sure. Thanks, Nick. I think the polling reflects where we've been.
Get the mic.
Sorry. The polling reflects where we've been, what the administration's done in its first 2 years and the debate and discussion in Washington, D.C. But I think we're going to see some shifts in 2023, and Kurt Campbell told us that. He said the administration is going to try to do two things at the same time, and I think we're going to see the Chinese reciprocate. We're going to try to build guardrails, expand dialogue, try and find areas to work on the economy together, and we're going to continue to press on technology with allies in the region and elsewhere. I don't see the U.S. taking their foot off the gas on these technology actions whatsoever. But I do think this year will be different in that we will see a recognition that overall economic decoupling is not possible. There's areas, even in technology and electric vehicles, where we have to stay together, where we can't do things on our own, and we're hearing that from our allies in Asia and Europe as well. And so I think it's going to be, 2023 will be the year of co-opetition with China on economics and technology. I will say, one that I think is not going to happen, financial decoupling. We saw the two sides reach a deal in the fall on Chinese companies listed in New York. And I think that's being implemented fine, and so I don't think we're going to see a rash of delistings. And in fact, because of China's economy likely to improve some this year, I'm not sure they're going to achieve as much as we'd like. There's going to be more money being piled into those stocks. We might see more listings, and so I think we'll see more financial connectivity rather than less.
Excellent. A couple minutes left. Take a couple of quick questions from the audience, and then we'll wrap up this panel. Would anyone like to chime in? Please, over here.
Do you, in terms of the use of force against Taiwan, do you envision a blockade, an air and sea blockade, as well as a, internet blockade as a more likely scenario than, an outright military invasion?
You want to start us off?
Sure. So I think if you're talking about 2023, I hope to say that I don't think either of them are very likely. But if you're talking about general how China thinks about use of force against Taiwan, I think both blockade, invasion, as well as other scenarios below that are all very, very likely. So when you talk about blockade, you were mentioning, I think you were implying a distant blockade, but there's also more kinetic blockades. There's also ways in which China could seize different offshore islands. So I guess what I would say is when we think about the various ways that China could use military force against Taiwan, from a U.S. planning perspective, we really have to think about the range of options. We can't just say China will only do X, Y, and Z. And I'm sure Jude will want to weigh in on this too. But my understanding is that the use of military force against Taiwan is not China's first and preferred option. But if trends don't go in the way that China wants, and if China wants to demonstrate its displeasure, it does turn to these tools, and we've seen this since last August, as a very easy way to demonstrate displeasure both against Taiwan and the United States.
Just very quickly, I think as we hear about various options, I think that China has, I think the immediate question we need to ask is how do we think they see that as achieving what goal, and what is their expectation of cost that they're willing to bear? And so when you start applying that framework, you start to think the next question after, will they do a quarantine? To what end? How do we think that would achieve ultimate political objectives? And the second is, a quarantine or invasion, China has has an advantage geographically given its proximity to Taiwan. China has a massive disadvantage given its geographic proximity to Taiwan. So a quarantine is essentially China deciding it's going to shut off its own major maritime corridor, right? So we've got 5 of China's biggest, ports are within the zone of where you would potentially see conflict, or a quarantine or a blockade would infringe upon. So I just think we need to push the analysis beyond would they do X? Maybe, but I think in the same way that the United States has a massive arsenal of things we could do, but we hopefully have a relatively rational discussion of what are the objectives we're looking to achieve with those and what cost are we willing to bear. And that's where I think China doesn't want to blow up its own economy, which it would do with an invasion or a quarantine, which is why China is pursuing to the left of those right now with increasing aggressiveness, and that's where we need to be focusing.
Thank you. Well, we're just about out of time. Co-opetition. I hope my spell check doesn't constantly auto-correct that, but that's a great way to capture the road ahead, at least for U.S. China relations. Thank you all, and please thank my colleagues for sharing their expertise. Take a very quick break.
Okay, we will start the second panel, which is on allies and partners. Again, my name is Victor Cha. I'm Senior Vice President here and Korea Chair. And we have a terrific group here, a very crowded stage, I see, because the United States has a lot of allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific. What can we say? So let me introduce them to you for those who are not familiar. So I'm going to go in the order on this sheet, which is not the order of the seating. Dr. Charles Adell, who is the Senior Advisor here at CSIS and the Australia Chair, formerly Policy Planning at the State Department. Christopher Johnstone, who is a Senior Advisor and Japan Chair, and probably the busiest man at CSIS this week, given the 2+2 and the summit, former NSC and DOD. Dr. Ellen Kim, who is Senior Fellow in the Korea Chair and Deputy Director. Yuko Nakano, who is a Fellow in the Japan Chair and Associate Director of the U.S.-Japan Strategic Leadership Program at CSIS. And last, but certainly not least, Greg Poling, who's Senior Fellow and Director of the Southeast Asia Program and the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative, AMTI, at CSIS. So we too have 4 sets of questions that we're going to ask you here at CSIS, as well as those of you in the audience to weigh in on. Again, to repeat, for those of you online, you go to pollev.com, pollev.com /CSIS Asia. Okay? And so I guess could we have our first question? So our first question is, which of the following leaders will gain the most domestic power in 2023? Yoon Suk-yeol, the South Korean President, Anthony Albanese, the Australian Prime Minister, Fumio Kishida, the Japanese Prime Minister, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., President of the Philippines. So let's see what we have here. Okay, we'll give it a second more, but it looks, oh, well, Kishida's moving up, so it's a last-minute surge. Okay, all right, why don't we lock it there? So clearly the winner, Greg, is Ferdinand Marcos Jr., and I think if you actually look at the public opinion polling, the latest ones that I've seen, that would also reflect correctly in terms of where he stands vis-a-vis the popularity of these other leaders. So over to you, Greg.
Yeah, well, I think any of these leaders and any leader in recent U.S. history would love to have Marcos's poll numbers. So there's no doubt that he is the most domestically powerful of these 4 leaders, which makes it a little hard to answer the question, right? I'm not sure he has a lot of room to go up. He's the most popular president in certainly the history of the current system, post-1986 Philippines, and he sits atop a kind of super majority of every powerful political family in the Philippines. So, and history being any guide, he's going to remain wildly popular for his first 3 years midterms. And then after the midterms, it'll be the long 3-year effort to position to replace him, and we'll start to see him decrease in some popularity. The only thing I would note is that there has been quite a lot of press recently in the Philippines about the recent shifts in the military. They just forcibly retired the AFP, the Armed Forces of the Philippines Chief of Staff, who was supposed to be there for a 3-year term. He didn't make it through his first year. And then recently the Defense Secretary retired as a result of that, both of which some chalk up to Marcos, in a sense, cleaning house of those who still have some loyalty to Duterte and clearing the way for him to put in his own people in the military. So you could argue that internally we are seeing continued consolidation within the Marcos regime.
Great, thanks. Charlie, Anthony Albanese is I think, sort of in the high 30s right now, I guess, in terms of popularity, but I'd love to get your views on how he's doing.
Yeah, I just want to say that everyone who's polled obviously hasn't been following the ins and outs of Australian politics, because if there's one story in Australian politics, it's the rise of Labour and Anthony Albanese. Look, you know, Mario Cuomo famously said that you campaign in poetry, but you govern in prose. In the Australian election, the Labour Party actually campaigned in prose. They said, we're a steady hand, we're not going to be that party of radical change. We just want to make sure, thank you, that we are seen as a steady hand. That wasn't an exciting message, but it was enough to tip things over, and they won election with a very small majority. But if you look at where the numbers have gone, they've gone nowhere but up in the first 7 months of his prime ministership. He now outpaces, the Labour Party outpaces the opposition by 10 percentage points. When Australians are asked personally, who would you like to see in the prime ministership, Anthony Albanese has about a 30-point lead over the opposition. And this is happening as interest rates have been rising in Australia. Let me just point out that that is very unusual in any country for that to happen. And if you look at the reasons for this, it's because the new government is seen as very competent, that it stepped out very well in foreign policy and national security arena, and that it is committed to climate change and the transition to renewable energies. However, and there's a big however, and I don't think we have to wait 3 years, as Greg was talking about in the Philippines, the big decisions and the more challenging governing aspects are all ahead of it and will all probably hit this year. The government's first major budget that they have to put forward comes out in May. You have rising inflation, you have rising cost of living. This is for a country that had 30 years of uninterrupted growth. You have the energy transition and rising energy prices, all coupled with the fact that we have major defense decisions in front of them. So I note all this because for the past 15 years, you've had a bit of a revolving door of leadership in Australia. 5 prime ministers over the last 15 years. And of those 5 prime ministers, none have been reelected and only one has finished out his term. The reason I gave you some of those poll numbers earlier is because commentators are already saying that you have the potential of a new governing majority with Labour in the lead here, but that will be premised on how well they can be seen to deliver increasingly tense, not only security, but economic conditions.
Terrific, thanks very much. Yuko and Chris, I'd like to ask you about what we see on Kishida. Maybe Yuko, you could start, and then Chris, if you could also talk about, as both Greg and Charlie, what are some of the challenges in 2023? But first, let's start with Yuko.
Sure. So to talk about how 2023 looks like for Prime Minister Kishida, I think it is helpful to quickly look back at 2022. So it was a year in which Mr. Kishida laid some groundwork on both domestic and foreign policy fronts, most recently adopting the new national security strategy and the other defense documents, which outlined among other things, a case for acquiring counter-strike capability, a major leap in Japan's post-World War II defense policy. And the government also announced an outline on how to fund the increased budget expenditures from 1% of GDP to 2% of GDP over the next 5 years, but punted the decision on details to this year. So I should also mention that Prime Minister Kishida led the ruling coalition to a solid win in the upper house election last July, but he has since seen some obstacles or setbacks, notably scandals over the unification church and their relationship with Japanese lawmakers and other political funding issues. So look ahead on the political calendar for this year, there are many items, of course, but I like to point out three items that which I'll be following closely. So first is that in addition to the follow-up debate on defense budget spending, the LDP will take up on discussion on new measures supporting child rearing. The Prime Minister Kishida aims to double the budget for childcare this year in an effort to address declining birth rates. And so there are of course, like a various opinion within the LDP on how to fund different government initiatives. So coming up with workable plans and also appealing for the public support for a set of tax hikes won't be easy sailing. And a second item is the nationwide local elections and 3 by-elections for the lower house in April. And the third item is the G7 summit, which he'll be hosting in May in Hiroshima, his hometown. That may not directly link to his domestic standing, but it is going to be an important opportunity for him to showcase his leadership credentials on the world stage. And one item that is not on the calendar yet, but could be added, is the possible snap election of the lower house. Their term will not expire until 2025, but there have been some chatter about possible election this year. So to conclude, 2023 will be a year in which Nagata-cho, or Japan's Capitol Hill, will continue to feel the reverberation of the previous year. And in terms of whether it is going to be a good year or turbulent year from Prime Minister Kishida, I think the best I can say at this point that it could go either way.
Great, terrific. Chris.
Oh, I'm sorry.
We're saving on microphones up here. So,
I don't have a lot to add to Yuko's really excellent points. It's been a rough few months for Prime Minister Kishida. It's interesting to me that he comes in second here in this poll. It really, since the election in July, he's had to deal with a series of scandals inside the party. And so even as Japan has taken really historic steps on the national security front that we'll get to more here, his government has sagged in the polls. But in my view, I do believe he's likely to recover. I think the diplomatic trip this week, the meeting with the president tomorrow, the G7 agenda, all these things I think promise to sort of raise the floor underneath him a bit. And I think his primary task is to address these issues related to the budget and taxation. He proposed a set of relatively modest, frankly, tax increases to help pay for the defense buildup, provoked a revolt even within his own party. So I think building a consensus around that, and then really taking on the significant economic challenges that Japan still continues to face. I think that's the big agenda for the year. Thanks.
Great, thanks. And then last but not least, South Korea, President Yoon. The audience didn't have him doing very well in 2023. Ellen, what is your views on this?
So when it comes to the Korean domestic politics, it's very difficult oftentimes to predict what will happen. But whether President Yoon will gain a strong domestic power this year or not, I think that largely depends on three things. One is whether he will be able to maintain recent gains in his domestic popularity. President Yoon had a difficult year in 2022 because his domestic approval rating plunged below 30% in less than 4 months after he took office. And then his approval rating recently bounced back and then rose about 41% in last December. So it's very important for him to maintain this current momentum. Another thing that we will have to watch is how Korean people will perceive this ongoing investigation into the main opposition party leader, Lee Jae-myung, who was recently questioned by the prosecutor for bribery allegations. So we'll see how this is going to play out domestically and affect President Yoon and his domestic standing. Currently, President Yoon and the ruling party have to work very closely with the main opposition party because the main opposition party holds a majority of seats in the National Assembly. But given what's happening, I think that the cooperation between these two parties will be very difficult. And what that means for the President Yoon is that he will have to focus on a lot of issues that matters a lot to the South Koreans. And the recent public opinion polling shows that economic recovery and real estate problems, and then defense and security issues are the three top key priority issue for South Korean people. So we'll see whether President Yoon will be able to deliver on some of these issues this year.
Great, terrific. Thanks very much. So that's a great start. We'll now move to the second question, which is the greatest military flashpoint in the Indo-Pacific region this year will be A, North Korea, B, South China Sea, C, Taiwan Straits, and D, East China Sea. So please vote. Well, there's a lot of activity in the South China Sea and the Taiwan Straits right now. Okay. We'll give it a couple more seconds. Just want to make sure everybody has a chance to navigate the EV poll website. Still moving. There's a bit of a delay. Okay, I think this is where we are. So very clearly, at least among the sample of this audience, it's North Korea. So let me go to Ellen and to Chris to get their views on this. So Ellen?
Well, the results are not surprising, obviously. I think the situation on and around the Korean Peninsula will not going to change much. North Korea will probably continue its weapon testing like last year to keep advancing its missile and nuclear capability. We may see that North Korea launch another or more new ICBMs or the first military reconnaissance satellite that they warned at the end of last year, or even a seventh nuclear test. Russia and China are probably not going to help to rein in North Korea. So United States and South Korea, Japan will probably have to respond to the North Korea provocations through enhanced information sharing and more military exercise and the deployment of the U.S. strategic assets to the peninsula, which I think North Korea will respond. So what I'm worried about most is the situation where two Koreas will be sort of trapped in a situation where they feel like they have to respond to each other, and which will raise the risk of miscalculation and an accidental military clash. And I do not think that North Korea have any capability or intention to launch a military attack on American soil, at least not now. But I think the country might be tempted to create a crisis on the peninsula so that they can undermine the credibility of the U.S. extended deterrence and then drive rage between the U.S. and South Korea.
Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, these are interesting results. I mean, the reality, right, is that any of these could be flashpoints, and that there are even others. I think about the India's northern border, for example, could very much be on the list here. And this just speaks to the fragility of the security environment in the Indo-Pacific, and also speaks to the motivations of so many of our partners in strengthening their own security posture. I would note, the East China Sea comes in low on this, and that's understandable. It's sort of out of the headlines in the United States. The reality is that PLA maritime pressure, Chinese maritime pressure in this area is unrelenting. There are incursions into the territorial waters around those islands multiple times every month. The size of the Chinese ships is getting larger. They loiter for longer periods of time. Japan's largest Coast Guard base is now in Ishigaki Island in the Ryukyu chain to enable a more regular Japanese presence to match the Chinese presence there. So this is an area that I think continues to bear watching, even though it stays out of the press a lot of the time, at least here. We're also, of course, entering a sensitive time in the cross-strait situation as the prospect of Taiwan's election cycle begins. And as Ambassador Cho said, and as my colleague Ellen said, North Korea's behavior, its missile programs, it's the prospect of another nuclear test, all of that points to a difficult year ahead on the peninsula. The good news, and this is what we'll get to, I think, in the coming questions, is it's clear that the region is responding. And American allies and partners are responding and taking steps that I think will help to deter aggression and will help to promote deeper cooperation among those of us on the other side. Thanks.
Great. Charlie, would you like to? What do you see in these answers?
Sure. Well, I see so many awful candidates of things that could go wrong, but I would also flip and anticipate that we have a lot of candidates. As we said at the beginning of this panel, this is the largest panel that we have, and it's the one where we're talking about allies and partners. So there are steps, there is movement being taken. I'm a little surprised that Taiwan Straits didn't come higher on the poll given all the talk that we've seen, given the discussion in the last panel. I'd say that here in Washington, we're not at 4-alarm fire quite yet on Taiwan. We're at like 3 3/4. So I'm surprised that's not a little higher. You know, Chris mentioned the fact that the Indian-Chinese border is not yet on here, and that could represent a potential flush. It's already heating up yet again this year. And I would say that I'm noting when we think about the proliferation of flashpoints, we do have military, so everyone responded appropriately here. But if we think about cyber, if we think about economic coercion, the list doesn't shorten, it actually continues to grow here. And I would just say in passing that when we look at this, one of the challenges is North Korea, debatable how much control China has, but South China Sea, Taiwan Straits, East China Sea, line of actual control, economic coercion, all these point back to China. And there are multiple pressure points that China has the ability to press on, but one of the challenges that we have persistently faced is that we tend to respond in one-offs at one of these as opposed to multifaceted, which is really the way that China has the ability to gain leverage in multiple areas at once.
Yuko and Greg, would you like to offer any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the poll is probably accurate. What separates North Korea from these others and the Indian border is that North Korea is the one place where you can imagine an intentional use of military force on the part of North Korea. I think the consensus, as we heard on the previous panel in Taiwan Strait, is like South China Sea and East China Sea, that we're going to see a continued focus on coercion and so-called gray zone pressure from China. And that always presents the possibility of escalation. I mean, who knows how many accidents we've seen over the last 10 years, any one of which could escalate to military force, but it won't be, presumably it won't be intentional. Now, Bonnie Lin did reference one of my concerns on the previous panel, which is that you could see some Chinese adventurism toward one of the Taiwanese-held islands in the South China Sea, either Ituabo or Pratas, in reaction to some new crisis that erupts cross-strait, but that still seems unlikely to me. I've been on this panel, or one like it, I think, since the first one of these that we did. And this is probably the first year that I would say that the situation in the South China Sea did not markedly deteriorate from the perspective of Southeast Asians over the course of 2022, meaning that in any quantifiably meaningful way, China was not in any greater control of the South China Sea on December 31st than it was on January 1st. Now, that's starting from a pretty low point, right? I mean, the Southeast Asians have lost a lot in the last 10 years, and particularly over the last 5. But you saw concerted pushback from the Philippines, both the latter Duterte and the new Marcos Jr. administration, from Indonesia, and more quietly from Vietnam over the last year, and no real escalation on China's part, meaning that we get the same 300 militia boats every day. We get the same dozen Coast Guard boats. The South China Sea is looking more and more like the East China Sea to me, meaning that there will always be the possibility that we wake up tomorrow and we have another EP3 incident. But China seems to have largely locked in what that coercion is going to look like. It seems more predictable than I would have said a year ago.
Yuko?
I would just add that from Japan's perspective, Japan takes any of the possibilities on this list here very seriously, either due to physical proximity to a possible flashpoint or a magnitude of strategic threats that it can pose to Japan's own national security. And that reality and a sense of urgency is shared by the Japanese public as well. And that's one of the factors that propelled the government to adopt the new defense and national security strategy.
Great, terrific. So this really sets us up well for the next question, which is, how is the United States going to respond, right? And so the question here is, in 2023, U.S. security cooperation will advance most with A, South Korea, B, the Philippines, C, Australia, D, Japan, and E, India. So please vote, and we will see how you think the United States should solve these problems that we've talked about in the previous question. So clearly there's a lot of support, this being Japan Week in the United States. Clearly there's a lot of foremost in the minds of many people. Give it another few seconds. Okay, very clearly, security cooperation in 2023 will advance most with Japan. So Chris and Yuko.
Well, I'm glad to see this group reach the right answer. No, what's interesting from my perspective is actually I think you could make a plausible case about basically any country on that list. And I think that says something. Says that all of our alliances and major partnerships are getting stronger. The U.S.-Japan relationship, the U.S.-Iraq relationship, certainly the U.S.-Australia relationship, U.S. relationship with the Philippines, ties with India, all are breaking new ground. And the other interesting point is the one that Kurt Campbell made this morning, that there's also growing cooperation among these partners. I point to, for example, Japan's deepening partnership with Australia. Kishida and Albanese issued a joint security declaration last year, deepening cooperation between Japan and the Philippines, and even the ROK. So it's a very, I think, a positive picture from a U.S. perspective as this web, almost a mesh of relationships, is building in the region, and I think makes a positive contribution to deterrence. I do think, as this group seems to, that the relationship with Japan is going to grow by leaps and bounds in the years ahead. The new national security strategy, national defense strategy that Japan released in December is truly path-breaking. There's been a lot written and said about that. I won't repeat all of it here, but plans to increase defense spending by something like 60% over the next 5 years, and 25% next year, which by itself shatters a long-standing norm. Acquisition of new capabilities, in particular long-range counter-strike capability, other capabilities in cyber, gives our two governments really a vast security cooperation agenda. And I think, particularly as you think about bringing online a Japanese strike capability, will invite a much more integrated U.S.-Japan alliance than we have seen before. Force posture announcements, adjustments to the Marine Corps presence in Japan announced yesterday. There's a deliberate sequencing here, right? It's no accident that this announcement follows so soon after the release of Japan's national defense strategy. I think it signals almost an integration of U.S. strategy and Japanese defense strategy in the region. I have a piece in Foreign Affairs coming out later today, actually, that talks about some of the next steps in the U.S.-Japan alliance. So as the Japan chair, it won't surprise you that I wholeheartedly endorse the results of this poll.
Yuko?
Well, I echo Chris's points on every point issues, but and there are things that the United States and Japan can begin implementing this year, but it will, however, take some time for the proposed programs to come to fruition. So it is an exciting time for the U.S.-Japan alliance, but there's a lot of work ahead.
Great, thanks. And then coming in second was actually South Korea. So Ellen, maybe you could comment on where you think U.S.-South Korea security cooperation is going in 2023.
Sure. So the main priority for the U.S.-South Korea cooperation this year will be enhancing the U.S. extended deterrence to South Korea. At the security consultative meeting held last year, two governments agreed to have a deeper dialogue, more military exercise, enhanced information sharing. Currently, there is a quiet discussion taking place between both sides about measures for joint planning and joint execution with respect to U.S. nuclear force. We do not know what that will look like, but this will be an important way for the United States to invite South Korea to have a better understanding about how U.S. nuclear umbrella will work and operate, and also have South Korea to participate in this process in some way so the U.S. can better reassure South Korea about growing concerns about the U.S. extended deterrence commitments.
Great, thank you. And Charlie, Australia, only 11%. That's kind of surprising to me. Is it surprising to you?
Well, I can't quite tell how to read this, and if it's because everyone's thinking about Japan this week, is it because people aren't paying attention to the very, very big announcements that are coming out this year from Australia, or it's because they doubt that any of them will materialize? I put my stock in the first two and probably not the third, although there's lots of churn and lots of debate about AUKUS, right? The submarine and tech innovation pact between the UK, Australia, and the US. And I would simply say that if it's a good outcome that we are having a debate among us about which of these countries is doing more on their own and with the United States, I just want to flag a couple of things because this is an enormous year in Australian defense policy. In late February or early March, they have a comprehensive defense strategic review coming out, the likes of which they're saying is the most comprehensive we've seen in decades, that will reorient how they think about funding, readiness, force posture, and procurement. That will come out shortly before the United States, the UK, and Australia announce the way forward on the AUKUS deal. And as we saw in late December with the Osmond 2+2, there are ever more things coming out about what US force posture in Australia is looking like. We've now seen initiatives announced that it will be augmented US land, air, and sea presence, the lengthening of runways, the refurbishing of ports in the Northern Territories, that's up top in Australia, so that it could potentially welcome a much larger US size, the prepositioning of munitions and fuel, and the welcoming on the heels of the Australian-Japanese announcement, more training with the Japanese both in Australia and in the region. And all of this is simply in the realm of US-Australian cooperation and says nothing about what the Australians are doing with the Japanese, with the Indians, and as we saw even earlier today, in their own region, with Papua New Guinea, with Vanuatu. So I think that this is a key moment for Australia, and where the US thinks about changing its posture, this is the key country that I think we want to look at. But I do want to stress that if this is a virtuous race to the top about which country might be doing more amongst the scholars who are up here as we talk about the countries that we track, it's also true and mirrored in the policy actions that are being taken in all these capitals to advance their own security.
Right, terrific. And then finally, Greg, the Philippines or any other countries in Southeast Asia that you want to comment on in terms of security cooperation?
This is the first poll where the audience clearly got it wrong. I'm very disappointed in all of you. I'll admit that Japan is the correct answer. But after that, come on. I think Charlie and I could have a fair argument about whether or not on December 31st of 2023 compared to January 1st, we will have seen more relative improvement in the U.S.-Australia or the U.S.-Philippine alliance. And I get that the Philippines flies under the radar. We've got plenty of decades of underestimating our oldest alliance in Asia, but At the end of 2021, you saw this 5-point roadmap for alliance modernization laid out by Secretaries Austin and at the time Secretary Lorenzana. That was codified in the last bilateral strategic dialogue. The 5 things: increase in foreign military financing. Well, we announced $100 million in new FMF to the Philippines this year. New maritime security dialogue, that was stood up this past spring. New bilateral defense guidelines. You know, the Japanese have gotten 3 of them over the last couple of few decades. Filipinos have never had any. Those are going to be released probably in the next BSD next month, if not Secretary Austin, I'm sorry, this month, if not Secretary Austin's next visit to Manila next month. Then you're going to have the new EDCA sites, the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement sites. I think the Philippines is the only one of these places where we're talking about significant potential new American access, not changing what kind of forces are placed, but actually Americans getting access to new facilities. It's an open secret that there will be 5 new EDCA sites announced on top of the 5 that there already are, and some of them will probably be in northern Luzon, where they clearly only make sense for a Taiwan contingency, not a South China Sea contingency. The only thing they haven't done is the military information agreements they've been negotiating, which they'll get a Band-Aid, I assume, next month, and that'll continue to go. But overall, I see nothing but positives on the U.S.-Philippine alliance, and I think that when we look back in a few years, if all of this works, we're going to say that there was a 2-year period in which the U.S.-Philippine alliance joined the adult table, right? It went from being this relic of the Cold War to being part of a larger network with the Australians, the Japanese, and the ROC. And it's all going to happen this year.
Terrific. Okay, our last question is, so this is really a question that is testing, or it's asking you what you think the priority should be. Which of the following priorities in the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy will feature most prominently this year? My guess is many of you are going to read that will as should, so it's really talking about policy priorities. So it's Pacific Islands, good governance, the Quad, ASEAN, and U.S., Japan, South Korea trilateral cooperation. I'm going to vote on this one too.
Really faded at the end there.
Okay. We're still seeing a lot of movement. There's nobody who cares about good governance and accountability? Not even one person? Not even one person? Come on, just one person. There you go. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Okay. Okay. All right. It clearly is, or at least people think it should be, U.S., Japan, South Korea trilateral cooperation, and then the Pacific Islands. Actually, quite interesting. So why don't we start with trilateralism? So who would like to?
Go ahead. Start.
Yeah, I actually agree with the results. I think the U.S., ROK, Japan trilateral cooperation will likely gain strong momentum this year because the leaders in 3 countries actually very much understand the very importance of this cooperation given the very pressing security challenges coming from North Korea. So the 3 leaders actually had a summit in Cambodia last year, which showed that there's a united front against North Korea, but also these 3 countries are closely aligned in their strategic thinking and regional strategies in Indo-Pacific. So the trilateral joint statement that came out of this summit, and also South Korea's Indo-Pacific strategy that came out last December, I think these 2 documents will become a very important basis that 3 countries can build on and expand their trilateral cooperation this year.
Very much agree with everything Ellen said. In fact, I'll go out on a limb and suggest that I think there's likely to be a significant breakthrough, particularly in Japan-South Korea ties, over the course of 2023. Ellen has mentioned the very rapid pace of trilateral engagement, really at all levels of the government. The joint statement in Phnom Penh, which really set out a pretty vast and encompassing agenda for the three countries, and it's an agenda that extends well beyond the peninsula, right, to include trilateral discussions on issues related to to economic security. On the defense side, there's some really interesting practical things that are happening. The commitment at Phnom Penh to begin sharing in real-time missile threat data, very significant development that didn't get a lot of attention, but would represent, if you were to build an integrated missile defense architecture in East Asia, that's the step you would start with. So not saying we'll get there quickly, but a very significant step. So the strategic basis for this relationship is strong. It's getting stronger. There are still issues related to history that encumber the Japan-South Korea relationship, but I'm optimistic that we're on the cusp of breaking through and moving past some of that. Thanks.
Thanks. Charlie, on the Quad of Pacific Islands, or anything else you'd like to say?
Yeah, no, we get to cheat up here because we don't have to just vote for one. And when we say will feature most prominently, it's obviously going to be more than one of those. And starting at the very first presentation coming from the White House to your ears, we heard Dr. Campbell say that building resilience in the Pacific Islands was something that he was committed to, and that the proof is in the pudding about our follow-up. The first thing that you can look for on this is how the U.S. moves forward with its COFA negotiations, which we're trying to wrap up all three of those this year. You also heard that delivery on the Quad, right, we can begin to count on more than two hands the number of Quad work streams, but there's a significant opportunity when the leaders meet again in Sydney in May, and what they said on the other, on the final one too. So I would suggest that we're going to see movement and prioritization more than one of these things, but you have seen on the Pacific not only a rise in the elevation of the importance of that, but now you're going to begin to see the turn the crank for delivery of some of the provinces, I believe.
Excellent. Okay. Yuko?
Yes, just to follow comments by Ellen and Chris, I'd like to say a few words on the ROK-Japan relations. So I remember that our last year's Asia-Pacific Forecast event, the audience selected the ROK-Japan relations as most likely the bilateral relationship that will most likely to improve in 2022. And I was surprised by that result, and then I offered rather cautious remarks. And since then, I've been asked on many occasions that so why Japan does not seem to be warming to the Yoon government's sincere overture, or what else can Seoul do to improve ties with Japan? And those are very difficult questions to answer without stepping on anyone's toes or sounding insensitive. But I think the bottom line is, this is purely from a Japan's standpoint, the bottom line is that the things can move forward if and when Japan can feel assured that any proposals, the resolution proposed by the South Korean government will be the final say on the matter of history issues. And I am more hopeful than a year ago that things are moving towards that direction.
Great. Greg, ASEAN?
I would just note that strengthening ASEAN is not even the most important priority of the administration's Southeast Asia policy, much less its overall Indo-Pacific policy, if by that we mean ASEAN as an institution. The Quad is more important, I would argue, in our Southeast Asia strategy at the moment than ASEAN is. ASEAN, the U.S. will support, of course, all the partners will support, but ASEAN is not dealing with any of the most important strategic or economic issues of the 21st century in the Indo-Pacific at the moment, and we can't force them to. So instead, what you're seeing is a dual track in which we engage with ASEAN on those things ASEAN is willing to talk about and hide behind ASEAN on Myanmar. And then on everything else, we engage unilaterally with partners who are willing to go the places we want to go, which primarily means the Philippines, Vietnam, Singapore, Indonesia, and to a degree, Thailand.
Terrific. So I think you've gotten a sense from our group today that we will see quite a bit of deepening in relationships between U.S. partners and allies, not just bilaterally, the traditional hub and spokes, but this very prominent and active feature of networking, minilateral, plurilateral, multilateral seems to be the path for the year forward. So thank you very much, and thank you all for listening. We will now transition seamlessly to our third panel, which will be about economics and governance issues. So thank you to our panel.
do it, so can you. It's relatively easy. Send a text message to 22333 with CSIS Asia. You also have the opportunity to participate via web browser at pollev.com/CSIS Asia. So I invite you to participate. And thank you for everyone who remains in the room and to our virtual audience for sticking with us as we kick off the third panel, which is on economics. And I'd just like to make a quick comment about how one thing that struck me on the last few panels was how economics and trade were really the cross-cutting topic that touch on security, politics, and policy. So I look forward to this discussion. To my right is Raymond Vickery. He is a senior associate non-resident with the Wadhwani Chair here at CSIS. He has an illustrious career in international affairs here in DC, having served, among other positions, as Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Trade and Development. Next is Erin Murphy, who is a senior fellow and deputy director of the economics program here at CSIS. She formerly held positions at the CIA and Development Finance Corporation, and I believe in the last 12 months has published her first book, Burmese Haze, U.S. Policy and Myanmar's Opening and Closing. So happy to hear more about that as we go through our comments today. Matthew P. Goodman is Senior Vice President for Economics. He also holds a Simon Chair in Political Economy here at CSIS. He has held several positions throughout the U.S. government, including at the Treasury Department and on the National Security Council. Last is Bill Reinsch, who holds the Scholl Chair in International Business here at CSIS. He formerly was the president of the National Foreign Trade Council, spent 20 years on the Hill, and also served as undersecretary of what is now the Bureau of Industry and Security at the Department of Commerce. So with that, let's go ahead and turn to our first question. Pull this up. So the first question is, which country is most likely to withstand economic headwinds this year? The choices we have are India, China, the United States, and Japan. Just give it a moment here. Okay, it looks like the United States is kind of a clear winner. It surprises me a little bit because I saw recently that the economic forecast for India is quite good, with an anticipated 7% annual growth this year.
You're influencing the vote. Go ahead, Emily. Go ahead.
I'm not agreeing or disagreeing. Okay, let's go ahead and call that. Go ahead and stop the voting. All right, so we have the United States at 53%, India with 26%, China with 16%, and Japan with 5%. Ray, let's go ahead and turn it over to you for preliminary comments.
Yes, I thought that your comments were very well taken, and if you want to influence the vote, that's great. I think the answer is clearly India. India will be growing about 50% more than the Chinese economy this time. It is either going to be the number one or number two among all major nations in the world. It's growing about, it will grow in 2023 about 8 to 12 times as fast as the United States economy or the Japanese economy. It is the year of India, I believe, because India will be the presidency of the G20. It will be the chairman of the heads of state for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Today it's convening 75 nations in the South Dialogue. And so the stars, I think, are aligned. And if you look underneath the hood at the fundamentals, they're all good. Domestic demand is very great. The amount of foreign exchange reserves is fifth in the world. And the other economic indicators are good. The financial markets, the foreign indirect investment and direct investment has recovered very nicely. And so I think that the answer should clearly be India in terms of economic headwinds. That's not to say there aren't going to be challenges. Everybody knows that. This is not a good year for the world economy, but India is going to be far ahead of the world average in that regard.
Well, thank you. I look forward to hearing whether our panelists agree or disagree. Matt, let's start with you.
Well, I would have voted for India as well. I think that's the right answer. But I'm encouraged and a little surprised that people are so optimistic about the United States. If that's true, then I think the world's going to do better than expected in growth. I mean, the IMF, last time they formally put out a forecast, was at 4% or something for global growth. They're about to update that, and I'm guessing they're going to lower that number. And people are saying this could be the slowest year for growth in 30 years, except for the 2008-9 crisis and obviously the first year of the pandemic. So, and that's largely because I think the expectation is the big countries, starting with the United States, are either going to barely grow or maybe even be in recession. And that's obviously a result of all the disruptions in the global economy that we've seen with COVID and with the Ukraine war and food and energy markets. The impact of that on inflation, which is probably going to start, moderating a little bit. In fact, the CPI numbers were just released an hour or two ago for December here, and they show a slight tapering off, still 6.5% CPI inflation in the U.S., but slightly lower than previous months. I think it's the 6th month in a row that it's been sort of tapering off. So that's the big question really in this whole story is, is the audience right? The U.S. is going to actually do better than expected. If so, that's good for the world because we're the biggest economy in the world. Or is it going to fall into recession? As for, the other reason that people are worried is China. It was talked about, I think in the China panel there was conversation about this, that, what's likely to happen as the COVID problem, I don't think is going to dissipate in the first quarter. You're probably with the Spring Festival or the Chinese New Year migration, it seems likely COVID's going to spike, and so growth is going to be really probably hampered by that. But later in the year, you may get a sort of a bounce effect from that. But the question then is fundamentally, I think Lily said this, there's some other headwinds that China faces, a lot of headwinds from demographics to real estate challenges to whether Xi Jinping is really going to move back towards reform and opening. And then I would just say one word about the number 3 economy in the world, Japan. People forget. Japan is still number 3. And it's starting from a high base, remember, because it's a big country. It may grow 1.5%, 2%, which, for Japan is not too bad given that the population's declining. So Japan will probably do, okay for Japan in 2023. But obviously it's going to face some of the same headwinds, and if the central bank, and particularly if there's a new central bank governor who ends up being a little more hawkish, meaning starting to move towards tightening monetary policy, that could crimp growth in Japan a little bit more than people maybe expect. So those are.
Bill, I won't ask how you voted, but is the audience correct?
Yes. I'm in the U.S. camp moderately. I think that the Fed has done a good job so far of dealing with inflation. It's subsiding slowly, but that's kind of what you want. And I'm hoping they can produce a soft landing. I do think that the challenge, the headwind, if you will, going forward is not going to be inflation 6 months from now. Although it's related, it's going to be a worker shortage. We're already in the middle of a worker shortage, and people my age are retiring or dying. I'm not planning on that, but and the worker shortage is going to get significantly worse. So we already have, a lower percentage of Americans in the workforce than I think has been historically true for a long time. It's not going to get better. Demography rules, and there's only so many people. The answer to this problem is immigration. We don't have a coherent immigration policy. And the issue is not just STEM and high-end, PhDs who are going to contribute to our semiconductor industry, which is very, very important. But, the reality is we need a lot of other people. We need a lot of healthcare workers, we need plumbers, we need electricians, we need construction workers, and we don't have them. And until we can produce a coherent immigration policy, that's going to be a problem, and that's going to produce upward pressure on wages, which in turn is going to produce inflationary pressures that may offset what the Fed is trying to do. So that's what I'm worried about, in the second half of this year and going forward after that. But in the short run, I think right now we're doing a pretty good job of managing the economy.
Okay, great. Thank you. Erin, anything to add?
Just a few things, because I think we really covered it. I do agree with the audience, but I would say that in terms of growth, I think that India will definitely have the largest amount of growth, partly because it's a developing economy. It has pretty significant sectors with a lot of investment. It's a G20 year, and I think for a lot of these economies, whether they're able to withstand these economic headwinds is part of the choices that they make. And so the same with India, they have an opportunity to take advantage of their G20 year. China, I think it's going to be a rough first and possibly second quarter, but definitely first quarter. For the United States, I think it's demonstrated remarkable resilience during the pandemic. Relatively speaking, obviously, the globe was hit pretty badly by the pandemic and everyone's economy with it. But as Bill was alluding to, we have some serious challenges in our economy that will have to be dealt with through political decisions. And, if the beginning of this year is any indication, again, this is going to be more of a problem of our own making. Poor Japan. Good luck to them. But it's also their G7 year. I think that they can depend on an influx of tourism as well. And, I think it's just going to be kind of more of a solid year pending any other debacle.
Well, thank you for bringing up both the G7 and the G20. That's a great segue to our next question. If we could please pull that up. So our second question is, which of the following will have the greatest impact on regional economic architecture this year? Our options are APEC, IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, the G7, the G20, or the CPTPP. Okay, IPEF is looking popular. The G7, not so much, despite it being Japan Week. Okay, let's give it just a couple of more seconds. Okay. All right, let's go ahead and stop the voting there. Matt, let me start with you for initial reactions.
So first of all, I want to say two things that are not on that list. One is RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, and I think if that had been up there, we might have seen some interest in that, although I wouldn't have voted for it as the first choice, but just worth noting. The other thing is we're all policy wonks, and those are all sort of governmental policy organizations, but to me, one of the interesting questions about regional economic architecture this year is what will happen in the market, in the private sector. Will there be shifting supply chains and people moving stuff around in response to the various risks that we have been talking about? And I guess Bill and others will talk about supply chains in a minute, but just to make a note of that before we get too wonky here on policy. Let me just put in a word for APEC. I'm not surprised it didn't get a high marks, but the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum is an important little tool of U.S. policy in the region. We were a co-founder when it started in the late 80s, and then since it's been a presidential forum since the early 90s, it was the reason the U.S. president went out to the region. We are hosting this year. We last hosted in 2011. I was in the White House then and worked on this. And, there's a lot of useful, interesting things you can do to promote regional economic cooperation and sort of connecting synapses at various levels throughout governments in the region. So it's an important little body, and particularly because the U.S. is hosting in San Francisco in November the Leaders Summit. That is worth watching for sure this year, but I wouldn't exaggerate it either. So on IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, I think that's a reasonable answer. Clearly, the Biden administration is putting a lot of emphasis on this forum as their, the kind of the sharp end of the spear of their economic strategy in the region. There was a ministerial meeting in California last month, and there are probably going to be a series of working level negotiations. And what everybody is wondering about is whether we're going to see any early harvest from these negotiations before the APEC summit. I think you'll probably get something because there'll be some pressure, particularly in the commerce-led pillars, which are supply chains, clean energy and infrastructure, and anti-tax and corruption. The trade pillar led by USTR, there's signals that they're not going to move quite as fast, and that's not surprising. Trade's hard, but and those issues are a little more contentious. Shameless advertising. Bill and I and you, Emily, have issued a number of reports over the last year about IPEF, and we've got another one coming out in the next week or two on the digital trade component of IPEF, and we've sort of been sounding out domestic stakeholders. I'm going to skip to CPTPP on this list because the difference between IPEF and CPTPP is quite significant on two levels. First of all, the U.S. is in IPEF and it's not in CPTPP, and in my analytical view, should be. In fact, maybe someday will be, to stick my neck out. The other big difference is that CPTPP is an actual trade agreement that is in place, and I think now 9 of the 11 remaining members have now entered it into force. And so it is going to start having some impact, I think, on the ground in terms of how trade flows. But the big questions are this year, first of all, is the UK going to be added because they're in the accession process? What's going to happen to China and Taiwan, each of which has applied? On that one, probably the answer is neither is going to be close to joining this year. And then, the big question is the U.S. actually going to take a new look at this, as the Washington Post in an editorial last week advocated, and as I think is in the U.S. interest, but I'm not holding my breath. I would just say one final thing about trade, and Bill will say more, I'm sure, but I think it'll be interesting to watch if the trade debate changes in 2023, because for a number of reasons. I mean, first of all, typically, and this is hardly an original thought, but when a president loses one of the houses of Congress in the second half of his term, he tends to be less able to do stuff domestically, focuses more on foreign policy, and trade is a part of foreign policy, and he has limits on how much he can do without Congress, but he can. I think when he goes out in the world, he's definitely going to hear, and particularly in the region, about how much people want the U.S. to engage in a traditional trade policy. So that's one thing. Also, the U.S. has made the investments promised by the Biden administration domestically that could be the basis then for going out and making the case for trade. That's a point that I don't think so many people are making, but the argument against doing trade is that we haven't done enough to invest at home in American workers, but now arguably the Biden administration could say they are doing that. I think one other thing is that's going to maybe kick in is that and we're going to talk more about this, but I think as we tighten our sort of, let's call them economic security tools like export controls and possibly banning TikTok, let's to get your imagination going. If the U.S. government bans TikTok, there are going to be about 100 million parents in the United States who had no idea what we were doing on China policy, who are suddenly going to realize they're going to hear from their 13-year-old kids that this is an atrocity and an appalling thing. And I think there's going to be some blowback against some of those measures, and that may be setting the stage for something. And business is going to be, I think, agitating about some of the export controls and so forth. So that's a kind of thing that I'm watching, is the dynamics on all of that. We're going to talk more about that, I think, the next time. Oh, and just on the 2 Gs, already noted, India's hosting the G20 and Japan's hosting the G7, so there is an Indo-Pacific sort of accent to those two forums. I do think that's important, but I think it's also correct in a question on regional economic architecture. It doesn't have quite the same impact. I do think one other thing to note is that in the G7, interestingly, there are no elections scheduled in any of the G7 countries, which suggests there might be a little more opportunity for the G7 in addition to all the other reasons to do some interesting things this year. But whether that's going to really affect regional economic architecture is a different question.
Okay, thank you, Matt. I'll just add one interesting factoid about CPTPP, which is that Uruguay has also applied to join. So I think the map is expanding, maybe with or without us. So Ray, would you like to add anything to that question?
Well, I think that the emphasis on G20 is correct. India is taking this very, very seriously. They're having over 200 meetings in 50 different cities in India. They've already had a very successful development working group in Mumbai. And if you look at where the center of the economic gravitas is in the world, it's clearly, it seems to me, shifting toward G20, because you do, unlike G7 and some others, have a more comprehensive group involved in it. So I think that the G20 will have an impact, not just regionally, of course, but across the world.
Okay, unless there are other burning comments, I think we can go ahead and move on. Bill?
Yeah, I think I misunderstood the question. If the question is impact on architecture, I think audience wins, because IPEF, frankly, is the only game in town architecturally right now. I interpreted the question as what would have the biggest economic impact, which is why I would have voted for CPTPP, because alone in the list, it's an actual trade agreement with binding commitments. And I think as it begins to be fully implemented by all of the members, it's going to have a much more significant impact on the region, including rearrangement of supply chains, because one of the things that happens when you develop a competent regional structure, countries that are outside the tent discover that it's better to be inside the tent if they want to access the market. And with Japan, among others, in the market, it's inside the CPTPP. It's a pretty big market, and I think I'm not surprised that more people want to join, although, Uruguay wanting to join gives no meaning to the Pacific idea. Of course, the UK already crossed that threshold, but you're going to see more people joining. I think you're going to see a rearrangement of supply chains going on in a way as a result of the strength of that agreement. That said, I think on supply chains generally, and Matt enticed me to say something about it, I'm increasingly thinking that the key actors there are not governments, they're companies. And what we're going through now is that companies are basically going through a massive risk reassessment, reassessing both the economic and political risk of doing business in various locations, Russia being the most obvious, but in Asia it's really about the political and economic risk of doing business in China. If you're Australia, you have direct experience with China's weaponization of trade policy. If you're Lithuania, you have even more direct experience. These things make companies nervous, and thanks to COVID, thanks to past U.S. trade policies in the previous administration, companies are very alert to now to the need to have resiliency built into their supply chains. That's a fancy term for don't put all your eggs in one basket. So they're looking for other baskets. That means they're looking for new locations, not necessarily to leave where they are, but to create alternative sources of supply, so that if, in apolitical terms, there's an earthquake and your factory implodes, your entire supply chain is not paralyzed. There are other scenarios, namely, China shutting you down for one reason or another. You're going to think about going elsewhere. But those are company decisions, and they're slow. It takes time to unwind existing relationships, and it takes time to build new ones, because you need to certify The new ones can scale up to meet your demands. The quality and price are appropriate, et cetera, et cetera. So no tsunami, but sand leaking out of the bag. But, you know, governments can put their thumb on the scale by making it harder or easier for companies to do that. But, yeah, I get to answer that one too. But,
The audience any clues.
but in the end, you know, the companies are going to take the lead on supply chain management, I think. So I will stop.
On that note, let's proceed to the third question, which is on supply chains. If we could please pull that up. So the question here is, which of the Biden administration's supply chain resilience strategies is most likely to succeed? The options here are nearshoring or reshoring, increasing export controls and investment screening, hardening defenses against cyber attacks, cooperating with allies and partners on the protection of critical technologies, or reestablishing U.S. semiconductor leadership.
Power of persuasion, 15%.
Okay. All right, let's give it just a couple of more seconds here. Okay, let's go ahead and close voting there. So it looks like D won out, which is cooperating with allies and partners on the protection of critical technologies. That also happens to have been last year's winner, although the threshold last year was at 46% instead. So it looks like this year more people believe that cooperation with allies on technology will be the big winner. In second place is nearshoring, reshoring, then increased export controls and investment, followed by semiconductor leadership, and then last, cyber attack protection. So Bill, let's go back to you for more comments on supply chain strategy.
Well, you know, if the question had been which ones are likely to be employed, the answer is easiest, all of the above, because the administration is doing all of those things. When you ask what's likely to succeed, you have to kind of say, what does success mean? You know, for those of you that pick the winner, cooperation with allies, what is success? Getting the allies to all speak with one voice, or getting that voice to have an impact on, and this probably have an impact on China and Chinese behavior? I think, yes, you can say that we're doing a good job so far, I think, of getting allied cooperation, particularly on export controls and on sanctions, but we did that. The greatest success was with Russia, where there was a very specific event, an invasion, that mobilized everybody. In the absence of that kind of triggering event, can you get allied cooperation, for example, on similar policies with respect to China? I don't think it's that clear. You know, if there's an invasion of Taiwan, yeah, I think so. That's a triggering event that would outrage the rest of the world. Absent that kind of thing, if you talk to the Europeans, which are, you know, a big chunk of our friends and allies, you get very mixed views about how far they should go. I think they're moving in our direction on these issues, but are not there yet. So, you know, it depends a little bit on how you define success. Reshoring, nearshoring, I think that's the case, as I said in the last question. I think that's really being led by companies, and the reality is they're doing that. But they started doing that 10 years ago because they were concerned about energy prices, shipping cost volatility, a whole bunch of things that don't have anything to do with the policies we're talking about. And they wanted to be closer to their customers. They wanted to have shorter, more rational supply chains. That's going on anyway. Will that succeed? It depends on what success means. Companies are doing it, and so in that sense, you know, I think the policy will be accomplished. The Biden administration is encouraging that. And in some cases, if you look at semiconductors, I think that appears to be working. We're clearly, I think, going to see more export controls, and we may see, are likely to see some sort of investment, outbound investment policy. It remains to be seen. That we've been waiting for that one since September. It's been imminent since September, so the latest gossip is that, you know, it's still imminent, but it won't show up until after Secretary Blinken visits China, which means it's off for another, I don't know, month or 6 weeks. So hardening resistance against cyber attacks? Sure. I'm sure that's underway. I certainly hope it's underway. And reestablish semiconductor leadership, you can see that clearly is underway already via the CHIPS Act, and you can see it succeeding. You've got multiple companies, both U.S. and foreign, announcing new investments in this in the United States in various parts of the semiconductor supply chain. So I think we're moving down the road on all of them, and a good number of them I think are likely to have an impact.
Matt, would you like to chime in?
Just one point to add to Bill's, all of which I agree with. I think the test of whether you're right, the audience, about this cooperation with allies is whether Japan and the Netherlands, two key allies, are going to move forward with controls on semiconductors that align with the ones that were announced on October 7th, which, if nobody has said this yet, if you don't know the date October 7th, it's like 9/11 or Pearl Harbor Day. It's in this world, it's a hugely significant day when the U.S. imposed these controls on advanced semiconductors. And the big question right now is, are Japan and the Netherlands going to follow? I think probably yes, but we'll see.
I think that brings up another interesting topic, which is one that Charlie touched on earlier, which is that follow-through is a different scenario. We can put forward all of the cooperative press statements in the world, but if we don't actually make these policy changes, then cooperation means something different. So Erin, I don't know if you'd like to chime in as well.
Just a few things. I think, the mode of success here is also what decisions do businesses make. And I think when you look at export controls and investment screening, when you pile on sanctions, when you don't have a very clear supply chain, and you can't, I think that there's not a full understanding as to how complex supply chains are. I've used the example of just, my jacket alone probably has 10 to 15 manufacturers involved, from the buttons to the thread to the dyeing to the materials to the manufacturing of the jacket itself. But when you start working in complex industries, whether it's a car or even semiconductors, it really, can get into the tens of thousands, or actually 10,000, depending on how complex it is. Companies get spooked, banks get spooked, and they won't necessarily lend to companies that are working in some of these industries because honestly it's not worth the effort to then potentially get caught up by OFAC or get in trouble in any other sort of legal sense. So I think, how the administration can be clear on what they mean on some of these things, which, as we know, is not very, I think will, have a factor in whether or not these are successful. But I think I would agree with the audience here. But, making sure that the U.S. doesn't shoot itself in the foot with some of its own policies where, you get all of this cooperation, especially on critical technologies, and then you have the IRA and CHIPS Act, and that angers the very allies and partners that we're trying to work with. So, these are going to have to be considerations going forward.
Ray, anything to add, or should we move
Yes,
forward?
I'd like to just broaden a little bit on the first one, nearshoring. Friendshoring is also an initiative of the Biden administration. India, it seems to me, is a major beneficiary in terms of what is happening with China. People, you may call it friendshoring or nearshoring or whatever, but people recognize it's a more stable environment. So FDI in India was at a record level in fiscal year 21-22. It's down a little bit this year. But I think that as the international situation gets more exacerbated, people, particularly with China, are going to look at other alternatives, and that means more investment in places like India.
Well, thank you all for those thoughts on the supply chain question. We are just about out of time, so let's go ahead and move to the fourth question, which is about the most effective infrastructure and development financing vehicle in the region. Which one will be most effective in 2023? First, we have the Belt and Road Initiative, then we have the Trilateral Infrastructure Partnership, the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, the Blue Dot Network, and then last, the Quad. Okay, it looks like the Quad is so far the most popular. Okay, Belt and Road is catching up to trilateral infrastructure. Okay, let's go ahead and stop the voting there. Aaron, let's have you kick this one off. I know you've been doing a lot of thinking about these various development finance vehicles, and you were recently at the Development Finance Corporation. I know Matt likes to joke that he took a lot of the Indo-Pacific talent away from the DFC.
Took all of the Indo-Pacific talent.
Yeah, so is the audience correct?
No. As someone who worked on 4 out of these 5 very intimately, I have to say the Quad, I mean, folks, think of it, infrastructure and developing financing. That means that all 4 of those partners have to work together on infrastructure. So I think the most important thing to think about is, what is infrastructure? This is not something that moves quickly. There's a lot of impatience about how we need to build roads and ports and bridges. It does not go from concept to contract in 3 months. These things take years. So it's not going to be infrastructure week. It's going to be infrastructure life. And I'll be selling those t-shirts after this. The Quad, you know, they're doing a lot of good cooperation, but I think it really depends on the project. I was involved in the March 2021 COVID-19 project, and how that worked so well is that each partner was able to find something along the project life cycle to make it work. And I think that that is much more of a better approach to infrastructure financing and development financing, is to find your niche on a project life cycle or in a sector than trying to find ways to co-finance. First of all, that's 4 governments or 3 governments or 7 governments giving term sheets and its various requirements to a special purpose vehicle, which is the entity that invests in a said infrastructure project. No one wants to do that. And it just takes a lot of time. And I think that's where Belt and Road is probably the most successful. BRI has changed a lot. It's not, you know, the BRI that we knew and feared in 2013. It's run into a lot of problems, and for good reason, in that, you know, it purposefully ignored feasibility studies and the input of serious investors, even within the Chinese economic system, and looking at that. But what they had on their side was speed. To be able to make more of a one-stop shop for getting the project, getting the approvals, getting the financing, and starting the construction. So even from that, from concept to contract, it still took a few years. So if we're thinking in terms of that, if 3 to 5 years is fast, like, that's how we need to think about this as well. I am actually a lot more optimistic about the Trilateral Infrastructure Partnership. This was formed in 2018 between Japan's Bank for International Cooperation, the DFC, and Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and Export Finance Australia. No, it does not have a lot of projects under its belt. The Plough Spur is one of them, but they also just announced a digital connectivity project in Papua New Guinea by acquiring Digicel's network. Telstra will be leading the project, and I think that gets to the core national security and foreign policy concerns of all 3. I mean, that's the other thing, is there's so many factors to think of in infrastructure, and especially with partners, is this a national security or foreign policy priority? Is this a bankable project? Because if it's not bankable and you want private sector involved, it needs to make money, or you need to denote that this is either a global public good or something that is so inherently important to national security or the security and development of the country that you're working in, and maybe development finance isn't the question. I could go on forever about that. Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, you may have known this by its previous acronym, or not, B3W, Build Back Better World. It's moving, but it's going to run into the same issues that partnerships do, and trying to coordinate everyone. There's a lot of focus on the Indo-Pacific region, particularly Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Central America. You know, in terms of what money has gone forward, big numbers, big promises, but actual action, I think we have yet to see. I'm assuming that the votes for Blue Dot Network came from the State Department trying to promote this. It lives, folks. Blue Dot Network lives, but it's not so much a development financing vehicle so much as it's a standard-setting body. And what it's meant to do is certify quality infrastructure and investment. But it's moving as part of PGII. The OECD is leading a lot of the studies as to how countries and companies can take on the standards. It's not new standards, it's just pulling from standards that are already out there that companies and countries already adhere to, whether it's IFC or OECD guiding principles. But shout out to my State Department folks for chugging along on Blue Dot Network. But yeah, the Quad folks, I don't know if you've worked with governments on infrastructure projects. It's not easy, and definitely not with those partners. So.
Well, thank you, Erin, for clarifying about Blue Dot Network. I actually asked Erin this question last week, does it live? And she informed me that it does, in fact, live. So thank you for those comments. Ray, would you like to chime in?
Yes, I'd like to put in my vote for saying that the audience got it right with the Quad. And it's not a question of, as Pele used to say, where the ball is now, but where it's going to be. It seems to me the Quad builds on trilateral infrastructure partnership and also the G7 initiative. And I think with Australia at the host and helm this time, there's going to be a major push back against Belt and Road Initiative, and that will come through the Quad. And it seems to me the Quad, with India involved, is in a better position to be able to marshal these resources than the other groups.
Matt, very short intervention, or short on time.
2 words, infrastructure hard.
Okay, well, that sounds like the second T-shirt idea that's come out of our panel today. So please come back next year. We'll have T-shirts and hopefully a lively discussion. With that, I would like to thank everyone for tuning in. I've gotten a lot out of the sessions today. I hope you have as well. This is an annual event at CSIS. We invite you to watch the live recording that will be posted later and share that. And then otherwise, tune in. And thank you again for everyone who's stuck through the third panel.